Have you ever wondered what it might have been like to stand on the deck of one of the largest wooden ships ever built, watching unfamiliar coastlines emerge from the horizon centuries before European explorers set sail? To witness vast fleets carrying tens of thousands of sailors, diplomats, and treasure across oceans that many believed held only monsters and endless darkness. History remembers names like Columbus and Magellan, their stories told in textbooks around the world, but there exists another tale, one far more magnificent and shrouded in mystery, a story that begins not in Europe, but in Ming Dynasty China, under the command of one of history's most extraordinary admirals. This is the tale of Zheng He, a man who led 7 epic voyages between 1405 and 1433, commanding hundreds of ships that dwarfed anything the world had seen. His treasure fleet sailed across the Indian Ocean, reaching the coast of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and perhaps even further, exchanging goods, knowledge, and culture on a scale that rewrites our understanding of global exploration. Yet, despite the sheer magnitude of these journeys, much of Zheng He's story remains hidden, obscured by time, political intrigue, and mysteries that scholars are still unraveling today. What were the true purposes of these voyages? What astonishing technologies and secrets did these ships carry? And why, after such grandeur, was this chapter of history nearly forgotten? In this video, we're setting sail into the heart of these questions, uncovering 30 astonishing secrets hidden within the voyages of Zheng He, secrets that challenge not only what we thought we knew about maritime history, but the very narrative of human exploration itself. From rumored maps that may have inspired later journeys to whispers of encounters that defy explanation, each revelation pulls back another layer of this grand, enigmatic saga. So join me as we embark on this journey together, tracing the wake of Zheng He's legendary fleets and discovering why his story is more relevant and more thrilling than ever before. To grasp the sheer scale of these expeditions, we must begin with the very heart of the fleet, the legendary treasure ships themselves. Modern historians often compare the vessels of the age of exploration, but the numbers associated with Zheng He's flagships defy all comparison and border on the unbelievable. According to ancient Chinese records, these treasure ships, or Bao Chan, were described as being over 400 feet long. To put that into a perspective that is almost difficult to comprehend, that is longer than a modern football field. Imagine a wooden vessel constructed without any of the power tools or engineering software we have today, stretching the length from one end zone to the other. For context, Christopher Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, was a mere 85 feet long. Zheng He's treasure ship was nearly 5 times that length. The descriptions get even more astounding. These leviathans of the deep were said to have had 9 masts, their sails catching the wind like massive, floating palaces. Their beams were estimated to be so wide that multiple traditional ships could have fit side by side across their decks. They were equipped with luxurious cabins for diplomats, vast holds for treasure like gold, silk, and porcelain, and even sophisticated watertight bulkhead compartments for buoyancy and damage control, a revolutionary naval technology that wouldn't become standard in the West for centuries. But here is where our first genuine secret emerges, a controversy that historians and naval architects have debated for decades. Could wooden ships of that immense size have even been seaworthy? Some scholars point to physical evidence, like the enormous rudder post uncovered in a Nanjing shipyard in 1957, which suggests a vessel capable of supporting a rudder that was itself over 30 feet long. This artifact alone lends powerful credibility to the historical texts. Others, however, remain skeptical, arguing that the physics of wooden shipbuilding would have made a 400-foot hull too flexible and vulnerable to the immense pressures of the open ocean. They propose that the measurements might have been exaggerated for imperial propaganda, or perhaps they referred to a different, non-standard unit of length. This debate isn't just about numbers on a page. It's a mystery about the limits of ancient engineering and whether the Ming dynasty achieved a nautical miracle that was subsequently lost to history. The existence of these colossal ships challenges our entire understanding of maritime technology in the 15th century, suggesting a level of sophistication that the rest of the world would not match for hundreds of years. And if the sheer size of the ships sparks debate, then the methods by which they navigated the vast, uncharted oceans are perhaps an even greater secret. Steering a fleet of hundreds of vessels across thousands of miles of open water required more than just courage. It demanded a technological and intellectual sophistication that seems to belong to a different era entirely. While European explorers later relied on crude dead reckoning and often clung to coastlines for fear of getting lost, Zheng He's navigators employed a system that was nothing short of revolutionary. At the heart of this system was an array of advanced tools that would have been the envy of any contemporary European mariner. They used detailed nautical charts known as Maocan maps, which were remarkably accurate for their time, plotting coastlines, sea routes, and even noting prevailing winds and currents with impressive precision. But their most crucial instrument was the compass. The Chinese had perfected the magnetic compass centuries earlier, but the ones used on the treasure fleets were housed in elaborate, balanced cases that allowed for precise readings even on a pitching deck. Some accounts suggest they may have even used a liquid-filled compass, a technology that dampened the needle's swing for a steadier reading, something that wouldn't appear in the West for hundreds of years. Yet the true secret of their navigation lies beyond the compass. It was their mastery of celestial navigation, known as Qihang Xingxi, or sailing by the stars. Navigators used a complex array of instruments to take star elevations. One of the most fascinating was the Qihang, a star altitude measuring board. This was essentially a set of 12 square wooden boards of varying sizes, each with a string attached to its center. By holding the board at arm's length and lining up the North Star with the top of the board and the horizon with the bottom, a navigator could use the string to calculate their latitude based on the board's size and the angle measured. It was an elegantly simple yet profoundly effective tool for its time. This leads us to one of the most controversial claims surrounding these voyages, that Zheng He's fleet may have possessed knowledge of the world that predated and even influenced European exploration. A few historians and enthusiasts point to certain interpretations of ancient maps, suggesting that the detailed information the Chinese collected could have somehow made its way west, perhaps through trade routes or captured documents, indirectly informing cartographers like Martin Behaim or even Christopher Columbus himself. While this remains a highly speculative and hotly debated theory, it underscores a profound truth. The treasure fleets were not just floating markets, they were floating universities of geography, astronomy, and oceanography, gathering a body of knowledge about the world that was unparalleled in the 15th century. Their ability to traverse such distances with such consistent accuracy suggests a scientific understanding of the planet that the Western world was only beginning to glimpse. This incredible technological prowess makes the subsequent disappearance of its official documentation all the more baffling and tragic, leading us directly into our third and perhaps most frustrating secret, the case of the lost Imperial mission records. We know these voyages happened on a grand scale, so where is the paper trail? Where are the detailed captain's logs, the meticulous accounts of, trade, the maps charting every new island and coastline? The sobering truth is that the vast majority of the first-hand accounts from Zheng He's own voyages are simply gone. The primary source we rely on today is a stone pillar, a stele, erected by Zheng He himself in 1431 near a temple in Fujian province. It provides a crucial first-hand summary of the voyages, but it is just a summary. The true treasure would have been the immense archives that surely existed within the Ming court, the veritable records of the Ming dynasty. These were the official, comprehensive chronicles of each emperor's reign, and the Yongle Emperor's section would have contained exhaustive details on his most ambitious and expensive project, the treasure fleet. Yet, when scholars and historians go looking for these specific records, they find alarming and suspicious gaps. This deliberate void in the historical record has fueled centuries of speculation. The most prominent theory points to a calculated act of political sabotage. Following the death of the Yongle Emperor, a new faction of scholar officials came into power at the Chinese court. These men were deeply Confucian, inward-looking, and believed China's strength and virtue came from its agricultural heartland, not from expensive, risky naval adventures. They saw the treasure fleets as a colossal waste of state resources that benefited foreign barbarians more than the Chinese people. To them, Zheng He's voyages were the vanity project of a previous regime, and they were determined to end them permanently. The most infamous figure in this theory is a minister named Liu Daxia. In 1477, decades after the voyages had ceased, it's recorded that he discovered a set of the fleet's records in the imperial archives. Horrified by the cost they detailed, he is said to have proclaimed that these were deceitful exaggerations of bizarre things far removed from the testimony of people's eyes and ears, and that they should be destroyed. And according to the historical account, he did just that, ordering them burned. This single act, if true, would have been a catastrophic loss for world history, an attempt to erase a monumental achievement simply because it didn't align with a new political ideology. But another, even more dramatic theory suggests the records weren't just destroyed to save money, but to conceal the true, mind-bending extent of Chinese exploration. Could the Ming dynasty have reached the Americas, Australia, or circumnavigated the globe long before Europeans? Proponents of this idea argue that the records were so threatening to the established worldview of the inward-looking officials that they had to be eliminated to prevent any future emperor from being tempted to restart the voyages and discover what they had truly accomplished. Without the primary documents, we are left with tantalizing clues and dead ends. The mystery deepens when we consider that not all records may have been destroyed. Some may have been hidden away for safekeeping during periods of dynastic turmoil, like the fall of the Ming to the Qing in the 17th century. Loyalists to the old regime might have secreted away priceless documents to prevent them from being captured or destroyed by the invading Manchus, their locations forgotten over time. This offers a sliver of hope that somewhere, in an attic or a sealed cave or a forgotten temple repository, a trunk full of Zheng He's original charts and logs awaits discovery, ready to rewrite history once and for all. The absence of these records is a haunting silence, a gap in our global story that speaks volumes about how history is not just written, but often deliberately unwritten. Perhaps the most tantalizing and fiercely debated secret of all is the possibility that the wake of Zheng He's treasure ships did not stop at the coast of Africa, but instead stretched across the entire Pacific, arriving on the shores of the Americas decades before Christopher Columbus set sail. While mainstream history credits European explorers with the discovery of the New World, a growing body of controversial, circumstantial evidence suggests the Chinese may have gotten there first. This theory, while not universally accepted by academia, is built on a fascinating mosaic of artifacts, maps, and botanical clues that, if proven true, would utterly shatter the conventional narrative of global exploration. Let's begin with the artifacts. Along the Pacific coast of North America, from California to British Columbia, several unusual discoveries have been made over the years. The most famous are the so-called Chinese anchors found off the coast of California. These are large, donut-shaped stones made of a rock that geologic analysis showed was not local. Some researchers claimed these were identical to stone anchors used by Chinese fishermen for centuries, while skeptics argue they could be from much later 19th century Chinese immigrants. The proponents point to their location in deep water, suggesting they came from ships of a size and type that later immigrants simply did not possess. The intrigue deepens when we look to the maps. The most explosive piece of cartographic evidence is the controversial Fra Mauro map, created in Venice around 1459. This world map, incredibly advanced for its time, depicts details of Africa and the Indian Ocean with an accuracy that European explorers could not have possessed. The map's creator wrote that his source was a junk from India, a term that often referred to Chinese ships. This has led some to speculate that the information came from the knowledge brought back by Zheng He's fleets, which had recently sailed those very waters. Even more startling are interpretations of ancient Chinese maps, like the legendary Kunyu Wangguo Quantu from 1602, which some argue shows an understanding of the American continent's western geography that predates significant European exploration of that coast. Then there are the biological and cultural clues. How did sweet potatoes, a crop undeniably native to the Americas, find their way to Southeast Asia and China by the late 15th or early 16th century? The linguistic evidence is compelling. The word for sweet potato in many Polynesian languages is kumara, strikingly similar to the Quechua word cayuma from the Andes. This suggests a pre-Columbian transfer across the Pacific. While Polynesian voyagers are the leading candidates for this exchange, the scale and documented range of Zheng He's fleet make them a plausible, and some argue more likely, vector for this transoceanic transfer. Furthermore, alleged Chinese-style shipwrecks, specific artistic motifs appearing in pre-Columbian art that resemble Asian influences, and even linguistic parallels between ancient Chinese and Native American languages have all been put forward as pieces of this puzzle. Of course, the academic debate surrounding these claims is intense and deeply polarized. The mainstream historical community largely dismisses the notion of a Chinese landing in the Americas, citing a critical lack of definitive, uncontested evidence. They argue that the stone anchors are almost certainly from a later period, that the map interpretations are speculative and rely on selective reading, and that the cultural exchanges can be explained by other means, such as the incredible, but smaller-scale voyages of Polynesian navigators. For these scholars, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. If a fleet that large had made contact, they argue, the archaeological footprint would be undeniable and overwhelming, not a collection of ambiguous artifacts. The other side of the debate, often comprised of independent historians and researchers, counters that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but rather the result of the systematic destruction of the Ming records we just discussed. They posit that the official proof was deliberately burned, and what remains are these scattered, orphan clues, the anchors, the maps, the sweet potatoes, that survived precisely because they were outside the control of the court officials who wanted the story erased. This debate is more than just an academic quarrel. It's a clash over how history is written, what counts as evidence, and who gets to claim the title of first. It forces us to question whether our understanding of the past is complete, or if it has been shaped by centuries of Eurocentric storytelling that simply overlooked or ignored a different possibility. Whether you find the evidence compelling or circumstantial, the very existence of this debate underscores the most profound secret of Zheng He's voyages. Their potential scale was so vast, their ambition so limitless, that almost nothing seems beyond the realm of possibility. While the debate about trans-Pacific voyages captures the imagination, what we know with absolute certainty from surviving records and archaeological evidence is that Zheng He's fleets established a deep and transformative connection with the sophisticated kingdoms of East Africa. This wasn't a fleeting encounter, it was a sustained engagement that wove a thread of diplomacy and trade between two distant worlds, a connection whose legacy is one of the most tangible and fascinating secrets of the entire endeavor. The African coast represented the furthest confirmed reach of the treasure fleets, a destination that required navigating the complex monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean with pinpoint accuracy. Their arrival in bustling port cities like Malindi and Mogadishu in modern-day Kenya and Somalia must have been a spectacle unlike any other, with the colossal Chinese ships dwarfing the local dhows and their crews representing a civilization these African traders had only heard of in legends. The most famous and symbolic result of this exchange was the arrival of exotic African animals in the Ming court. Chinese records describe the giraffe, or kilin, brought back from Malindi as a moment of profound cultural significance. In Chinese mythology, the kilin is a benevolent, magical chimera-like creature whose appearance signals the arrival of a sage ruler or a new golden age. When the envoys from Malindi presented this astonishingly tall, graceful, and utterly unfamiliar animal to the Yongle emperor, his court scholars immediately declared it a divine omen, a heavenly endorsement of his reign and his ambitious maritime project. Alongside the giraffe came other incredible fauna, zebras, which were called heavenly horses, ostriches, and even lions. These living gifts were far more than mere curiosities. They were powerful tools of soft diplomacy. For the African rulers, offering such unique treasures cemented a valuable alliance with a powerful distant empire. For the Chinese emperor, receiving these auspicious beasts provided potent political propaganda, demonstrating that the virtue of his rule was recognized by heaven and by the farthest corners of the earth. Beyond the spectacle of the animal exchange, the true secret of the African connection lies in the robust and mysterious trading relationships that were established. The treasure fleets did not simply arrive, drop off some porcelain, and leave. They engaged in a complex, two-way exchange of goods that reveals a sophisticated understanding of global markets. From China, the fleets brought silk, exquisite blue and white porcelain, and spices. In Africa, they loaded their massive holds with goods that were equally precious in the Ming economy. Ivory, of course, but also rhinoceros horn, exotic woods, amber, and crucially, copious amounts of gold. The gold trade, in particular, hints at a deeper economic motive. The Ming dynasty was moving towards a silver-based economy, but gold remained a vital commodity for state reserves and luxury items. The access to new sources of African gold through these direct trade links would have been an enormous financial incentive for the voyages, a practical benefit layered atop the imperial pageantry. The cultural impressions left by this exchange went both ways and have left a subtle but enduring mark. Chinese pottery sherds, particularly celadon and blue and white porcelain, have been found in archaeological digs up and down the East African coast, sometimes incorporated into the walls of important buildings and tombs, signifying their value as prestige items. Some historians even suggest that certain architectural techniques, like the distinctive barrel-vaulted roofs found in parts of Swahili architecture, may show Chinese influence, though this remains a topic of debate. More concrete is the genetic and cultural legacy suggested by a number of ancient Chinese coins found in Kenya and the oral histories of local communities like the Bajuni people, who have long told stories of shipwrecked Chinese sailors assimilating into their society centuries ago. This was not a one-sided imperial mission, but a genuine, albeit temporary, interweaving of cultures, a moment in the 15th century when the Indian Ocean felt like a bridge between continents rather than a barrier. Yet with all the grandeur and all the voyages, a profound and unsettling silence lingers on the ocean floor. Given that hundreds of ships sailed on 7 major expeditions across some of the world's most treacherous waters, why have we not found them? The virtual absence of any conclusively identified shipwrecks from Zheng He's fleet is one of the most enduring maritime mysteries, a secret hidden not in what we've discovered, but in what we haven't. Consider the sheer statistical probability. We are talking about a fleet that may have numbered over 300 ships on a single voyage, undertaking journeys that lasted for years at a time. They braved the unpredictable fury of the Indian Ocean monsoon, navigated uncharted reefs, and faced the constant threat of storms that could scatter a fleet across 1,000 miles of coastline. Even with advanced technology for their time, the loss of some ships was an inevitability of ancient seafaring. For context, archaeologists have discovered wreck sites from the much smaller fleets of the Spanish Empire and the Roman trade routes. So where are the Ming dynasty's colossal treasure ships? Their disappearance from the archaeological record is so complete it feels intentional, sparking a host of compelling theories. The first theory points to the ships themselves and their revolutionary, yet ultimately fragile, design. We've already marveled at their immense size, but that very scale might be the key to their vanishing act. Constructing a wooden hull over 400 feet long presented unprecedented engineering challenges. To achieve this, Ming shipwrights relied heavily on a technique using multiple layers of thick planking, clinker style, and those famous watertight bulkheads. While these bulkheads were brilliant for containing damage, they may have created a unique failure mode for a sinking. Instead of a ship going down in one recognizable piece, the immense hydrodynamic pressures of a catastrophic event could have caused these gigantic, yet flexible, wooden structures to literally break apart at sea. The wreckage would then scatter across a vast area, leaving no large, coherent structure for archaeologists to find centuries later. The very innovation that made them so seaworthy might have ensured they left no trace on the seabed. A second possibility lies not in how they sank, but in where they sailed. The treasure fleets followed meticulously planned routes dictated by the seasonal monsoon winds. These were not random paths of exploration. They were well-established maritime highways used for centuries by Arab and Indian traders. The Chinese admirals would have had access to detailed knowledge about safe harbors, anchorages, and potential hazards along these routes. This expert navigation would have drastically reduced the risk of groundings on unknown reefs. Furthermore, the deep-draft treasure ships likely stayed in deeper water offshore, while smaller tenders handled the inshore work. Sinking in deep, open ocean far from land would mean a wreck site is exceptionally difficult to locate, resting in depths that have only recently become accessible to modern underwater archaeology. But the most intriguing theory suggests that some wrecks weren't just lost, they were forgotten on purpose. Imagine a treasure ship heavily laden with imperial porcelain, gold, and silk, meeting its end not in a storm, but perhaps in a politically sensitive area. Or consider the scenario after the voyages were banned. What became of the great ships? Historical records indicate that many of the remaining vessels were left to rot at anchor or were deliberately broken up. The court, wanting to erase all memory of the expensive naval program, had no interest in preserving them. For any that did wreck during the voyages, local communities who discovered the debris would have seen it not as an archaeological site, but as a sudden windfall of priceless materials. A scattered wreck would be systematically salvaged for its precious wood, its valuable metal fastenings, and any surviving cargo, leaving nothing behind but stories. The ships vanished because they were too valuable to leave at the bottom of the sea. Their remains scavenged and repurposed until every last physical memory of them was absorbed into the local landscape. This silent absence on the ocean floor is a haunting echo of the silence in the historical archives, a physical manifestation of a history that was systematically dismantled, forgotten, and waiting, perhaps, for one lucky discovery to finally break its centuries-long silence. To truly grasp the magnitude of the treasure fleet voyages, we must understand the extraordinary man who commanded them. For the story of Zheng He is as improbable and layered as the missions themselves. His journey begins not in the privileged halls of power, but in the brutal chaos of war. Born around 1371 in Yunnan province as Ma He, he was a member of the Hui, a Chinese Muslim minority. His world shattered at the age of 10 when forces of the new Ming dynasty invaded his region, which was still loyal to the previous Mongol Yuan rulers. Captured, he was subjected to the ancient and horrific practice of castration, a common fate for young male prisoners destined for imperial service. This traumatic event, which would have broken most people, became the unlikely foundation of his unparalleled career. He was taken to the court of the Prince of Yan, the man who would later become the Yongle Emperor, and entered service as a palace eunuch. This is where the first layer of his secret power emerges. In the Ming court, eunuchs were far more than just servants. They were a unique political class, barred from fathering dynasties of their own. They were considered less of a threat to the ruling family and were often granted immense trust and responsibility. They managed the inner palace, controlled access to the emperor, and handled sensitive communications. Zheng He, who was given his new name by the emperor for his loyalty in battle, excelled in this environment. His status as a eunuch was not a social handicap but his greatest strategic asset. It granted him constant, intimate access to the most powerful man in China, allowing him to build a relationship of absolute trust with the emperor that no traditional scholar official could ever hope to match. He was an insider in the most exclusive sense, privy to the emperor's deepest ambitions and insecurities. This unique position fueled his dual role as both supreme naval commander and master diplomat. The Yongle Emperor didn't just need a skilled sailor to lead the fleet. He needed a personal extension of his own authority, a man who could embody the emperor's majesty on the global stage. Zheng He was that perfect instrument. As admiral, he had to possess an encyclopedic knowledge of naval warfare, logistics, and meteorology to command a floating city of 28,000 men. But his more crucial role was that of a diplomat and an enforcer of the tributary system, the framework through which China managed foreign relations. He wasn't sent to conquer and colonize in the European style. His mission was to display China's overwhelming power and cultural superiority, to invite or compel foreign rulers to acknowledge the Ming Emperor as the supreme sovereign of the world, and to integrate them into a vast, China-centered network of trade and diplomacy. His success in this role hinged on a blend of awe-inspiring spectacle and shrewd political negotiation. Arriving in a new port with an armada of colossal ships, his soldiers and cavalry parading in perfect formation, he presented an image of irresistible power. But then the diplomat would take over. He would present lavish gifts of silk, porcelain, and gold, inviting local rulers to send ambassadors back to China with tribute. He mediated disputes between regional powers, punished pirates who disrupted trade, and installed friendly rulers, all while meticulously charting coastlines and gathering intelligence. He was, in effect, the emperor's eyes, ears, and fist across half the world, wielding a combination of soft and hard power on a scale never before seen. His ability to seamlessly transition between the roles of fearsome admiral and cunning diplomat is what made the voyages so profoundly successful, and it was a skill set uniquely enabled by his secret power, his unparalleled and direct line to the throne, unencumbered by the bureaucratic meddling of the civil officials who deeply distrusted the entire enterprise. Yet for all his unparalleled skill and the emperor's unwavering favor, the entire monumental project of the treasure voyages rested on a fragile foundation: the will of a single emperor and the economic surplus of a single moment in history. This brings us to one of the most pivotal and perplexing secrets of the entire saga: the abrupt and total cessation of these voyages. How could an empire that had achieved such staggering maritime supremacy simply turn its back on the entire world, dismantle its fleets, and retreat behind its own borders? The answer is not a single cause, but a perfect storm of political intrigue, economic pressure, and a fundamental philosophical shift that would alter the course of global history. The first and most immediate catalyst was the death of the Yongle Emperor in 1424. Zheng He's patron, the visionary who had greenlit, funded, and championed the expeditions, was gone. The new emperor, the Hongxi Emperor, reigned for less than a year, but his brief rule was long enough to set a new and hostile course. He was surrounded by a powerful faction of Confucian scholar officials who had always opposed the voyages. To these officials, the treasure fleets represented everything they despised: immense government spending on what they saw as frivolous spectacle, the empowerment of eunuchs like Zheng He over the educated scholar class, and a dangerous distraction from the real threats at home, namely rebuilding the economy and securing the northern borders against Mongol incursions. The Hongxi Emperor, sympathetic to their views, issued an edict suspending all treasure voyages immediately. Although Zheng He would lead one final, seventh voyage under the next emperor, the political winds had irrevocably shifted. The powerful bureaucracy had won, and the age of exploration was declared over. The economic argument against the voyages, relentlessly pushed by these officials, was powerful and, on the surface, quite logical. They framed the treasure fleets not as a profitable enterprise, but as a massive drain on the state treasury. The construction of hundreds of giant ships, the salaries for tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers, and the vast quantities of luxury goods given away as gifts to foreign rulers represented an astronomical cost. While the fleets returned with exotic goods, rare animals, and diplomatic envoys, they did not bring back the kind of massive, tangible wealth that later European mercantilist voyages would seek. The primary return on investment was political prestige and a strengthening of the tributary system, which to the inward-looking officials seemed like a terrible bargain. They argued successfully that the nation's resources would be far better spent on internal projects like granaries, irrigation systems, and fortifications along the Great Wall. In their calculation, the cost of projecting power across the oceans simply outweighed the benefits. Underpinning this political and economic opposition was a deep, centuries-old philosophical schism within Chinese statecraft. On one side were the Confucian traditionalists who believed China was the Middle Kingdom, a self-sufficient celestial empire whose virtue and strength flowed from its stable agricultural society and its moral example. Engaging heavily with foreign barbarians was seen as unnecessary, undignified, and potentially corrupting. On the other side were the less powerful but practically minded officials and the eunuchs who saw value in foreign trade, naval power, and external engagement. The death of the Yongle Emperor allowed the Confucian traditionalists to decisively win this ideological battle. They weren't just cancelling voyages, they were reasserting a worldview that placed China at the center of a static, hierarchical universe, not as a player in a dynamic, interconnected world. This intellectual victory led to the deliberate destruction of records and even the shipbuilding plans, an attempt to erase the very knowledge required to ever rebuild such a fleet, ensuring their inward-looking philosophy would dominate for centuries to come. The ultimate, world-altering consequence of this retreat was that it created a power vacuum on the high seas. Just as China was deliberately dismantling its oceanic capabilities, a handful of small, ambitious kingdoms on the far western edge of Eurasia were beginning to look outward. Within decades of Zheng He's final voyage, Portugal and Spain were launching their own expeditions, driven by a very different model. A combination of trade, conquest, and religious conversion designed to extract wealth directly from new lands. They faced no rival naval power of comparable size or technology. They sailed into an Indian Ocean world that had recently been peacefully patrolled by Chinese treasure ships and found it open for business and ultimately for takeover. China's withdrawal, therefore, wasn't just a national decision. It was a pivotal moment that inadvertently handed the keys of global exploration and eventually colonialism to Europe. The silence left by the retreating treasure fleets was filled by the sails of caravels, forever changing the destiny of the world. Beyond the political intrigue and the vanished ships lies a secret that captures the imagination like no other: the legend of lost treasure. We've established the immense scale of these voyages, but what of the almost unimaginable wealth they carried? Historical accounts describe the treasure ships not just as vessels of exploration, but as floating treasuries, their holds packed with a king's ransom in gold, silver, silk, and priceless Ming porcelain, all intended to project the overwhelming prosperity of the Middle Kingdom. These were not mere trade goods, they were instruments of statecraft, magnificent gifts for foreign rulers designed to awe them into the Ming tributary system. The sheer volume of this wealth, combined with the inevitable perils of the sea, has given rise to enduring legends of treasure-laden ships that vanished without a trace, their fabulous cargoes waiting to be discovered on some forgotten stretch of coastline or deep ocean floor. To grasp the potential scale of these losses, consider the recorded exchanges. When Zheng He's fleet arrived in a new kingdom, the protocol was one of breathtaking generosity. The Ming court records, fragmented as they are, note presentations of gold and silver ingots, exquisite bolts of silk embroidered with dragon and phoenix motifs, and vast quantities of highly prized blue and white porcelain. In return, the foreign rulers offered their own local treasures, pearls, gems, exotic spices, rare woods, and those famous giraffes. This was a reciprocal system of gift-giving on a diplomatic level, but the Chinese gifts were often of far greater intrinsic value, a deliberate demonstration of superiority. Now imagine a ship dedicated solely to carrying this imperial treasure, a floating vault. If such a vessel, packed to the beams with chests of gold and stacks of fine porcelain, were to founder in a storm or run aground on a reef, it would instantly become one of the greatest treasure hoards in maritime history. This leads us directly to the most tantalizing possibility, that not all of this treasure made it back to China. Legends from ports across the Indian Ocean, from Sumatra to the Swahili coast, speak of Chinese ships that encountered disaster. Some tales tell of vessels heavily damaged in storms being deliberately beached in sheltered coves for repairs, with part of their cargo being offloaded for safekeeping, only for the crew to never return. Other stories hint at political upheavals back in China causing fleets or parts of fleets to simply disband, with captains and crews deciding their fortunes were safer hidden abroad than returned to a court that might confiscate everything. There is also the more mundane, yet equally plausible, scenario of local rulers or communities who, upon seeing a ship in distress, may have seized the opportunity to salvage its cargo for themselves, its origins lost to local folklore over the centuries. The most credible whispers often point to the Malacca Strait, a narrow and notoriously treacherous channel between Malaysia and Indonesia that was a vital choke point on the treasure fleet's route. The strait has been a graveyard for ships for millennia, with shifting sands, unpredictable currents, and sudden squalls. It is precisely the kind of place where a massive, deep-draft treasure ship could have met its end. Local legends in parts of Indonesia and Malaysia persist about ancient shipwrecks of unimaginable size, different from any other vessels, their timbers holding secrets and perhaps even gold. While no wreck conclusively identified as one of Zheng He's treasure ships has ever been found, the persistent oral histories suggest that the possibility is more than just romantic fantasy. The true secret, however, may be less about a single sunken ship and more about a distributed network of hidden caches. The treasure fleets established temporary bases and depots in friendly ports across Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. These were secure warehouses for storing supplies and goods between monsoon seasons. It is entirely within reason that valuable cargo intended for future gifts or trade might have been left in such a depot for safekeeping. If a political order in China suddenly collapsed or if a particular voyage was abruptly cancelled, the knowledge of these hidden stores could have been lost. The officials who knew of them might have been purged or died, leaving behind written records that were later deliberately destroyed. This theory proposes that the real treasure isn't at the bottom of the sea, but buried somewhere under the modern cities that now sit atop these ancient port towns, waiting for a lucky construction crew or a dedicated archaeologist to stumble upon a hoard of Ming porcelain that rewrites our understanding of history's greatest maritime mystery. While the treasure fleets were designed as instruments of peaceful diplomacy, Sailing the world's most lucrative trade routes also meant navigating some of its most dangerous waters, from the pirate havens of the Straits of Malacca to the contested coasts of Ceylon. To protect their priceless cargo and the tens of thousands of lives on board, Zheng He's armada was equipped not just for show but for overwhelming combat. This was not a passive merchant convoy. It was the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen, armed with a terrifying array of advanced weaponry that combined cutting-edge technology with sophisticated psychological tactics, ensuring the fleet's dominance and making it virtually untouchable during its decades at sea. The backbone of the fleet's defensive and offensive power lay in its use of early gunpowder weapons, a technology the Chinese had perfected over centuries but now deployed at a truly naval scale. While European ships of the same era were still reliant on archers and boarding parties for combat, Zheng He's vessels were essentially floating artillery platforms. They were equipped with a wide variety of cannon known broadly as phalangi or Frankish guns, a name hinting at their possible earlier origins from the Middle East or Europe, but which the Ming had significantly improved. These were not the small, swivel-mounted breech-loaders sometimes seen later. Many were large, muzzle-loading cast bronze cannons capable of firing massive stone or iron cannonballs to smash enemy hulls, or terrifying grape shot, bags filled with metal scraps, to devastate enemy crews on deck. The thunderous roar and destructive power of these weapons, fired in coordinated broadsides from the high decks of the massive treasure ships, would have been a shocking and utterly demoralizing experience for any pirate crew expecting to prey on a vulnerable merchant vessel. But the technological innovation went far beyond simple cannons. Historical accounts and military manuals from the period describe a terrifying arsenal of gunpowder-based projectile weapons. One of the most fearsome was the huo qiang, or fire lance, an early predecessor to the firearm. This was a tube mounted on a pole, loaded with gunpowder and projectiles like pottery shards or iron pellets, which would be fired in a devastating scatter shot at close range during attempted boardings. Even more advanced were primitive fragmentation bombs and explosive shells, sometimes launched from ship-mounted catapults or trebuchets. These hollow clay or metal spheres were packed with gunpowder and iron bits designed to explode on impact, showering an enemy deck with shrapnel. Imagine the sheer shock and horror for pirates in their small wooden D-house, facing not just arrows but explosive projectiles that shattered with fire and noise, a type of naval warfare they could never have anticipated. The true genius of the fleet's combat doctrine, however, lay in its masterful use of combined arms and psychological warfare. The treasure ships never sailed alone. They were the centerpiece of a complete battle group. Each massive flagship was escorted by a variety of specialized military vessels, swift horse ships for troop transport and rapid response, agile patrol boats for screening the fleet, and dedicated troop carriers housing thousands of highly trained Ming Marines. This meant that any attacker, no matter how swift, would have to contend not with a single target, but with a deeply integrated and layered defense system. If pirates managed to close in, avoiding the cannon fire, they would then be met by volleys of arrows from massed crossbowmen on the high decks, and finally, by disciplined Ming soldiers armed with spears and swords ready to repel any boarders. The fleet could respond to any threat with overwhelming and graduated force, from long-range cannon barrages to close-quarters melee combat. The psychological impact of this military machine cannot be overstated. For the pirates and local warlords who considered challenging the fleet, the very sight of it was likely enough to deter aggression. The unimaginable size of the ships themselves created a sense of awe and intimidation. The coordinated maneuvers of hundreds of vessels, the flags and banners streaming in the wind, and the visible ranks of thousands of armored soldiers on deck projected an image of invincible imperial power. The sound alone would have been a weapon, the beating of drums and gongs used for signaling, which also served to create a cacophony of fear and confusion. When combined with the earth-shattering boom of cannons and the screams caused by explosive shells, the fleet engineered a sensory overload designed to break an enemy's will to fight before the battle was even joined. This was not just a navy, it was a traveling spectacle of absolute power, engineered to achieve its diplomatic goals through awe as much as through force, ensuring that the treasure of the Middle Kingdom could sail the seas unchallenged. This intricate religious duality was perhaps Zheng He's most powerful and unspoken diplomatic tool, a secret key that unlocked doors across the Indian Ocean. While he sailed as the official emissary of the Yongle Emperor, a ruler who patronized Buddhism and sought to present himself as a universal Buddhist monarch, Zheng He's own personal faith was deeply rooted in Islam. Born into a devout Muslim family in Yunnan and given the name Mahi, a name honoring the Prophet Muhammad, his spiritual identity was an intrinsic part of his character long before he entered imperial service. This placed him in a uniquely complex position. He was a Muslim admiral commanding a fleet that carried Buddhist monks and Taoist priests on a mission for an emperor who embraced a pluralistic but ultimately Chinese-centered spiritual worldview. Rather than being a point of conflict, this multifaceted identity became his greatest strategic asset, allowing him to navigate the complex religious geopolitics of his destinations with a nuance no purely Confucian official could ever muster. His role as a Muslim diplomat was most vividly demonstrated in his interactions with the powerful port kingdoms of Southeast Asia and the holy cities of Arabia. When the fleet arrived in Malacca or in parts of modern-day Indonesia where Islamic sultanates were beginning to rise, Zheng He could present himself not as a distant foreign conqueror, but as a respected co-religionist. He could participate in prayers, observe Islamic customs, and engage with local rulers on a foundation of shared faith, building an immediate layer of trust and camaraderie. This was particularly crucial in places like Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, where he is credited with helping to establish and strengthen Muslim communities, even leaving behind advisors who assisted in building local governance. His voyages corresponded with a period of rapid Islamization across the region, and his presence, backed by the overwhelming power of the Ming fleet, lent immense prestige and legitimacy to these emerging Islamic states, subtly integrating them into China's tributary system through spiritual kinship rather than just force. Simultaneously, he had to perfectly perform his duty as the representative of the Yongle Emperor's divine mandate, which was heavily steeped in Buddhist and Taoist symbolism. The treasure ships carried not just soldiers and goods, but also spiritual figures. They transported Buddhist monks who sought sacred texts from India, and they likely included Taoist astrologers who were vital for navigation and for interpreting omens. When paying respect to local Hindu deities in Ceylon or to Buddhist shrines in Siam, Zheng He would have participated in the appropriate rituals as required by diplomatic protocol, presenting gifts to temples and honoring local gods. This wasn't seen as hypocrisy. It was the practical application of a sophisticated imperial strategy that recognized and respected the spiritual power of others, all while asserting the supreme majesty of the Son of Heaven. Zheng He's ability to shift between these roles, praying in a mosque on Friday and perhaps overseeing a Buddhist ceremony the next day, showcased the immense flexibility and intellectual dexterity of both the man and the empire he represented. The most famous testament to this dual mission is the legendary journey he undertook to the holy city of Mecca. While there is some scholarly debate about whether he personally made the Hajj pilgrimage, given his status as a high-ranking imperial envoy, and a unique, strong historical evidence suggests that he at least sent deputies to perform the rites on his behalf. The very act of despacing part of the imperial Chinese fleet to honor the central tenet of Islam sent an unmistakable message to the entire Muslim world. The Ming dynasty was not an alien, pagan power, but a sophisticated empire that respected and included their faith within its vast cosmopolitan framework. This gesture of goodwill resonated deeply, fostering trade and diplomatic relations that lasted for generations. Zheng He masterfully used his faith not to convert others to Islam, but to build bridges of understanding, demonstrating that one could be both a loyal servant of the Chinese emperor and a faithful Muslim, a living embodiment of the harmonious coexistence the Ming court wished to project across the known world. Perhaps the most explosive secret tied to Zheng He's voyages is the claim that his cartographers did not just map the known world, but the entire world, creating charts so advanced they depicted continents that, according to conventional history, would not be discovered for another century. This theory hinges on one of the most controversial documents in the history of cartography, the so-called 1814 map. Its existence, if authentic, would not just rewrite history, it would completely shatter the Eurocentric narrative of the age of exploration. The map surfaced in 2001 when a Chinese lawyer and collector named Liu Gang purchased an antique map from a Shanghai dealer. This wasn't just any old chart, it was a map dated to the 18th year of the Yongle Emperor's reign, 1418, and it was titled A General Chart of the Integrated World. At first glance, it looks familiar, showing China, Asia, Europe, and Africa in a way that reflects the knowledge of the time. But then you look closer and the entire map seems to tilt off its axis. There, in the vast expanse of the ocean, are landmasses that bear a striking, almost unmistakable resemblance to the continents of North and South America, a rough outline of Australia, and even the frozen coast of Antarctica, all placed with a geographical accuracy that seems impossible for 1418. The map is a round world map, and it includes notes describing these distant lands, their people, and even their animals. If this map is genuine, it is arguably the most significant historical discovery of the modern era, implying that Zheng He's fleets had not only reached the Americas but had circumnavigated the globe and mapped it with breathtaking precision. Proponents of the map's authenticity, like author Gavin Menzies, who brought it to international attention, point to several compelling details. They argue that the depiction of the Americas is too accurate to be a lucky guess or a later forgery, noting specific features like the river systems that correspond to the Mississippi and the Amazon. The representation of Antarctica is particularly startling, as it appears to show the continent not under its modern ice cap, but in a state that suggests knowledge of its topography from a time when it was free of ice, information that modern science only obtained with 20th century seismic technology. How could a cartographer in the 15th century have known this? The theory suggests that the map is a copy of a much earlier original, itself based on the meticulous surveys conducted by Zheng He's fleet, and that this knowledge was compiled into a comprehensive map of the world that was subsequently lost or destroyed by the Ming court. Unsurprisingly, the academic establishment has responded to these claims with intense skepticism and, in many cases, outright dismissal. The criticisms are numerous and serious. First, there is the problem of the map itself. Experts who have examined it point out that it is written in simplified Chinese characters, a form that did not come into common use until the 20th century, not the classical Chinese that would have been used in the Ming dynasty. The paper and ink have not been conclusively proven to be centuries old through rigorous, independent forensic testing. Many historians conclude that the map is most likely a clever modern forgery, perhaps created in the 20th century based on known European maps and then artificially aged to create a sensational artifact. They argue that the geographical features, while impressive, can be explained by the forger using a modern map as a reference and simply distorting the projections and place names to make it look antique. Beyond the physical object, there is the glaring absence of any corroborating evidence within the vast corpus of Chinese historical documents. While the official records were destroyed, we have countless other texts, letters, and maps from the Ming period. Not a single one makes a definitive, unambiguous reference to the discovery of new continents or the creation of a world map of this scale and accuracy. If such a monumental achievement had occurred, would it not have left some trace, some whisper in other contemporary writings? The silence from all other primary sources is, for most scholars, deafening and ultimately disqualifying. The debate over the 1814 map is therefore a perfect microcosm of the entire Zheng He mystery, a tantalizing piece of potential evidence that promises to rewrite everything, locked in a stalemate with a historical record that has been systematically purged, leaving us to forever wonder what magnificent truths might have been lost to time. While the treasure fleets were designed for diplomacy and return, the sheer scale of their operations and the length of their voyages have led to a fascinating and controversial theory that the Chinese may have established more than just temporary bases. Some researchers propose that Zheng He's expeditions left behind not just trade goods and memories, but actual communities, lost colonies of sailors, craftsmen, and soldiers who, whether by choice, accident, or orders, settled in distant lands and were gradually absorbed into the local population, leaving behind a subtle but persistent trail of evidence that we are only now beginning to decipher. One of the most compelling areas for this theory is the region of Southeast Asia, where Chinese trade and migration have a long history. However, some genetic and cultural markers seem to predate the well-documented waves of migration from the 19th century. On the island of Java, for instance, there are communities with distinct traditions that some anthropologists believe could trace their origins back to the Ming era. The city of Semarang has legends that directly connect its founding to a figure named Zheng He, who is said to have left behind sick crew members to recover there. These men, the story goes, married local women and established a community that blended Chinese and Javanese customs. While it's difficult to prove a direct link to the treasure fleets, the persistence of these oral histories, passed down for over 600 years, suggests a foundational event that left a deep cultural imprint. The evidence becomes even more intriguing when we travel to the remote Lamu archipelago off the coast of Kenya. Here, among the Swahili-speaking communities, oral histories have long told of shipwrecked Chinese sailors from centuries ago. In the 1990s, a young girl from the Bajuni people named Mwamaka Sharifu made international headlines. Suffering from a severe illness that local medicine could not treat, she was offered a scholarship to study traditional medicine in China, based on her community's long-held belief in their Chinese ancestry. Once there, genetic testing revealed that she indeed carried DNA markers common in parts of coastal China. While this doesn't conclusively prove a link to Zheng He's specific voyages, as trade contacts existed before and after, it powerfully corroborates the local folklore and opens the door to the possibility that survivors from a wrecked treasure ship could have integrated into the community, their lineage preserved in the genes of their descendants. Perhaps the most dramatic claim of a lost colony is the story of the Sanai people on the island of Pate, also in Kenya. Local tradition speaks of a Chinese ship that ran aground on the coral reef centuries ago. The survivors, according to the tale, swam ashore, salvaged what they could from the wreck, and then burned the remains of their ship. They then used their knowledge of ceramics and construction to establish themselves in the community, eventually intermarrying and becoming a respected clan. In the late 1990s, a team of archaeologists and historians visited Pate and were shown ancient graves with Chinese-style porcelains embedded in them, a practice not common in local Swahili tradition. They also interviewed elderly residents who displayed physical features they believed were inherited from their Chinese forebears, and who pointed to ruins of structures they claimed were built with Chinese architectural techniques. While these claims are tantalizing, they are also hotly debated. Skeptics argue that the porcelain could have arrived through trade long after the Ming voyages, and that the physical features could be the result of much later genetic mixing. Without definitive archaeological evidence, like the discovery of a Ming-era settlement with unquestionably Chinese artifacts, the story of the Sanai remains a powerful and evocative legend, a ghost of a possibility that continues to captivate researchers. The challenge of proving the lost colony theory lies in the nature of assimilation itself. If a group of Chinese sailors did settle in East Africa or Southeast Asia 600 years ago, they would have had to adopt local languages, religions, and customs to survive. Within a few generations, their distinct identity would have melted away, leaving only the faintest of traces: an unusual genetic marker, a unique ceramic shard in a grave, a family story about ancestors from across the sea. These fragments are like whispers in a hurricane, difficult to hear and even harder to verify. They exist in the ambiguous space between history and memory, offering a thrilling glimpse into a world where the wake of Zheng He's fleet may have left a permanent mark on the shoreline of history, a hidden diaspora that challenges our understanding of these voyages as merely temporary missions of diplomacy. While European explorers like Vasco da Gama and Magellan would later lose countless sailors to the horrors of scurvy and shipboard epidemics, Zheng He's fleets managed to keep tens of thousands of men relatively healthy on voyages that lasted for 2 and sometimes 3 years at a time. This astonishing feat of maritime medicine wasn't just luck. It was the result of a highly sophisticated and organized system of health care that was centuries ahead of its time, a secret weapon that allowed the treasure fleets to project power across the globe without being decimated by disease. The scale of this achievement becomes truly staggering when you consider the numbers. A single voyage could carry over 27,000 people, a population larger than most European cities of the era, all crammed into a floating city of wooden ships. Keeping this many souls healthy in the close, often unsanitary conditions of a 15th century vessel, while facing unfamiliar climates and pathogens, required a medical program that blended advanced traditional knowledge with remarkably forward-thinking public health policies. At the heart of this system was a deep understanding of herbal medicine and nutrition, knowledge drawn from China's millennia-old medical traditions. Each treasure ship likely carried extensive medical chests stocked not with simple remedies, but with a vast pharmacopoeia of processed herbs, powders, and tinctures. Records from the era suggest they utilized plants like changelang, a type of aromatic rhizome, to purify drinking water stored in the ship's massive casks, preventing the spread of waterborne illnesses. For digestive ailments common on long voyages, they had remedies based on ginger and mint, but their most crucial nutritional discovery was their understanding of vitamin deficiency, specifically their prevention of scurvy. While European sailors would suffer for centuries with bleeding gums and weakness, Chinese physicians had long documented the curative effects of certain plants for a condition they called sand leg sickness. The fleet surgeons ensured the crew had a steady supply of fresh, vitamin C-rich foods. They accomplished this not through magic, but through brilliant logistics. They brought aboard vast quantities of soybean sprouts, which could be grown fresh on board in tubs, providing a constant source of nutrients. They also loaded up on citrus fruits like lemons and oranges at port calls, and preserved vegetables like pickled cabbage in giant ceramic jars, all of which helped stave off the debilitating disease that would cripple later European expeditions. Beyond treating illness, the fleet's medical officers excelled at prevention, implementing what we would now recognize as advanced quarantine protocols. When the fleet made landfall in a new region, particularly one where strange new diseases were known to exist, they did not allow a free-for-all disembarkation. Instead, they likely established a controlled cordon sanitaire. Sick crew members would have been isolated on specific vessels or in segregated camps onshore to prevent the spread of contagion throughout the entire population. This practice of isolating the sick to protect the healthy was a cornerstone of Chinese medical practice by this time, and its application on a naval scale was revolutionary. Furthermore, the very design of the ships aided in this effort. The watertight bulkheads that made the ships so resilient also acted as natural barriers, potentially allowing captains to isolate a sickbay compartment from the rest of the crew, slowing the spread of any airborne illness that broke out. This proactive approach to public health stands in stark contrast to the often reactive and chaotic responses to disease on European ships, where a single fever could race through an entire crew with devastating consequences. This medical prowess also extended to the realm of surgery and trauma care. With a fleet of hundreds of ships and a small army of Marines on board, injuries from accidents, storms, or the occasional skirmish were inevitable. Ming Dynasty medical texts from the period, such as the Jin Dynasty's systematic compendium of medicine, detail sophisticated procedures for treating wounds, setting broken bones, and even performing early forms of battlefield triage. The fleet surgeons would have been skilled in the use of acupuncture and moxibustion for pain management, and they possessed a wide array of surgical instruments made from bronze and steel. They understood the importance of cleaning wounds and used antiseptic compounds without knowing the germ theory behind them. For instance, applying wine or vinegar to injuries to prevent infection. The combination of nutritional science, preventive quarantine, and skilled trauma care created a holistic healthcare system that was the envy of the world, a hidden pillar of the fleet's success that allowed it to sail further, stay longer, and return healthier than any contemporary maritime power. This unparalleled medical support system was as vital to the mission as the sails or the compass, ensuring that the Emperor's most valuable asset, his human capital, remained intact to fulfill its grand ambition. Beneath the glorious spectacle of the treasure fleets and the diplomatic missions lay a much deeper, more personal, and far more precarious motivation. One that transforms our understanding of these voyages from a simple tale of exploration into a high-stakes political drama. To truly grasp why the Yongle Emperor invested such an unimaginable portion of his empire's wealth into these expeditions, we must look past the official narratives of tribute and prestige and into the very foundation of his power, which was built on a deeply unstable and contested claim to the Dragon Throne. The emperor, whose personal name was Zhu Dai, was not the rightful heir. He was the fourth son of the dynasty's founder, the Hongwu Emperor. The throne was meant to pass to his nephew, the Jianwen Emperor. But in a brutal civil war known as the Jingnan Campaign, Zhu Dai led a rebellion, besieged the capital Nanjing, and seized power. The official history, which he himself commissioned, states that the palace caught fire during the assault and the young Jianwen Emperor perished in the flames. But the body was never convincingly identified, and almost immediately, rumors began to swirl that the nephew had not died at all, but had escaped disguised as a Buddhist monk, vanishing into the vastness of China to perhaps one day return and reclaim his birthright. This created an existential crisis for the new Yongle Emperor. His entire reign was legally and morally questionable in the eyes of the strict Confucian scholars who valued lineal succession above all. He was, in their view, a usurper, a regicide. His immense project of building the Forbidden City in Beijing and moving the capital north was partly to escape the ghost of his nephew in Nanjing. But he needed more. He needed to project such overwhelming, undeniable power and prosperity that his controversial ascension would be forgotten, overshadowed by a new golden age. The treasure fleets were the ultimate tool for this. They were not merely diplomatic missions, they were a colossal public relations campaign on a global scale. By sending these magnificent armadas to the farthest corners of the known world, he was broadcasting a clear message to both foreign kingdoms and his own skeptical subjects. The mandate of heaven rests with me. My virtue is so great that even the most distant rulers acknowledge my supremacy. The giraffe from Africa was not just a curious animal, it was propaganda, a heaven-sent omen legitimizing the rule of a man who desperately needed it. This leads us to one of the most tantalizing and persistent secret theories surrounding the voyages, that a primary, hidden objective was to find the missing Jianwen Emperor. Think of the geography of Zheng He's expeditions. They sailed throughout Southeast Asia, a region with deep historical ties to Chinese Buddhism, and a logical place for a refugee pretending to be a monk to seek sanctuary. They traveled to Sri Lanka and India, other centers of Buddhist culture. Could these stops have been, in part, intelligence-gathering operations? The enormous crews of 27,000 men included soldiers, scouts, and diplomats, a perfect cover for agents quietly inquiring about rumors of a royal Chinese exile living in a remote monastery. The sheer scale of the fleet allowed them to comb coastlines and send parties inland under the guise of trade and diplomacy, all while secretly searching for the one man who could unravel the emperor's entire regime. Whether the primary goal was to find the missing nephew or simply to ensure he could never muster support from abroad, the voyages served a critical internal security function. By demonstrating Ming power so vividly in the ports and kingdoms where Jianwen might seek allies, Zhu Dai was effectively neutralizing any potential foreign backing for a rival court. No local ruler, seeing the invincible armada in their harbor, would risk the emperor's wrath by harboring a pretender to the throne. In this light, the treasure fleets were both a sword and a shield, a sword to seek out a hidden threat, and a shield to prevent that threat from ever materializing. The grandeur was a performance, the generosity a calculated demonstration of strength, all designed to secure the reign of an emperor who, for all his power, may have always been looking over his shoulder, haunted by the ghost of the nephew who got away. Coordinating a fleet of over 300 vessels across thousands of miles of open ocean presented a logistical nightmare that demanded more than just skilled navigation. It required a revolutionary communication system capable of overcoming the vast distances and howling winds that separated each ship. Imagine the challenge: maintaining formation, signaling course changes, or issuing emergency orders without the benefit of radio, satellite phones, or even telegraphy. The solution devised by Zheng He and his admirals was a sophisticated, multi-layered network of visual and auditory signals that turned the sprawling armada into a single, cohesive organism, able to respond to commands with a precision that would astonish navies for centuries to come. The most immediate and vital system relied on a complex language of flags and banners, a visual code that transformed the masts of the treasure ships into a kind of floating semaphore. This was far more intricate than simple colored flags indicating basic commands. Historical accounts and military manuals suggest the use of an entire lexicon of flags, each with specific shapes, colors, and sequences that conveyed detailed messages. A single yellow triangular flag raised on the foremast might signal a change in sailing formation, while a series of red square banners hoisted on the mainmast could order a specific combat readiness drill. The positioning of these flags was everything. Their height on the mast and their order of display created a syntax that allowed for an impressive range of communication, from "prepare to receive envoys" to "storm approaching, reef sails." On a clear day, with lookouts perched high in the crow's nests of each ship, these signals could be seen from several miles away, passed methodically from the flagship through the heart of the fleet to its farthest reaches. But the ocean is rarely clear and calm for long. For night operations or for communication through the thick fog and torrential rain common in the Indian Ocean, the fleet switched to a brilliant system of lanterns and audio signals. Large, colored lanterns, shielded to control their visibility, were used in patterns similar to the flags. The beating of massive drums and the deep, resonant tolling of gongs provided a sound-based layer to the command structure. These weren't just random noises. The number of beats, the rhythm, and the type of instrument used each carried a specific meaning. A rapid, urgent drumbeat might signal an immediate maneuver to avoid a hidden reef, while a slow, deliberate gong could indicate it was time to drop anchor. This combination of sight and sound ensured that messages could get through even when visibility dropped to zero, a critical failsafe for keeping the fleet together during the sudden squalls that could scatter a less disciplined navy to the winds. Perhaps the most intriguing and debated aspect of their communication, however, is the potential use of carrier pigeons. We know from other Chinese historical records that messenger pigeons were used for long-distance communication over land as early as the Tang dynasty. It is not at all far-fetched to propose that the treasure fleets, with their meticulous planning, may have carried crates of these birds on the largest ships. In an era without any form of rapid long-distance communication, a homing pigeon released from a scout ship hundreds of miles away could have been the only way to alert the main fleet of a discovered hazard, a change in current, or the location of a safe harbor long before the ship itself could return. While direct evidence from Zheng He's voyages is lacking, the practice was well within their technological grasp and would have provided a crucial strategic advantage, creating a one-way information network that stretched far beyond the horizon. This blend of the brilliantly simple and the ingeniously advanced allowed Zheng He's floating city to act as one, its movements coordinated with an efficiency that was nothing short of miraculous for its time. Yet the true diversity of the crew extended far beyond professional specialization, delving into the most personal and controversial aspect of these voyages, the possibility that women were not just present but played vital roles. For a Ming Dynasty expedition, this would have been profoundly unconventional, as Confucian norms largely confined women to the domestic sphere. However, the unique circumstances of these multi-year journeys may have necessitated exceptions that history has only recently begun to acknowledge. Some scholars point to fragmentary records and oral traditions that hint at the presence of women in specific capacities. One theory suggests that skilled female doctors and herbalists might have been included to treat illnesses among the crew, and perhaps more critically, to provide medical care for the wives and families of foreign dignitaries they encountered, a task for which male doctors would have been culturally inappropriate in many societies. Their expertise in areas like midwifery and women's health would have been an invaluable diplomatic asset when engaging with matriarchal cultures or royal courts abroad. Beyond medical roles, there are compelling suggestions that women may have served as interpreters or traders, leveraging networks and knowledge that their male counterparts could not easily access. In the bustling markets of Southeast Asia, for instance, women often played central roles in commerce, and having female crew members who could engage directly with these merchant networks would have provided a significant advantage in trade negotiations. Furthermore, the sheer length of the voyages, sometimes lasting over 2 years, opens up the haunting possibility that some sailors brought their families along, or that relationships formed in foreign ports led to women joining the crew for the return journey. While the official records approved by the court would have omitted such details to maintain a facade of orthodox discipline, the human reality of such an epic undertaking almost certainly involved a more complex social tapestry. These whispered possibilities challenge the traditional image of the treasure fleets as a solely masculine endeavor, suggesting instead a floating microcosm of society that was far more nuanced and human than the grand statues and formal chronicles would ever lead us to believe. This intricate web of flags, drums, and potential pigeon posts was just one layer of the fleet's communication strategy. The other, far more subtle and arguably more powerful, was the language of diplomacy itself. When Zheng He stepped ashore to meet a foreign ruler, every word, every gesture, and every gift was part of a meticulously crafted and highly secret diplomatic code, designed to project power, gather intelligence, and secure alliances without ever drawing a sword. This wasn't a simple exchange of pleasantries. It was a sophisticated form of statecraft that turned every port call into a carefully staged performance of Ming superiority and benevolence. The protocol began with a breathtaking display meant to overwhelm the senses and immediately establish a hierarchy. Imagine the scene: the colossal treasure ships anchoring in the harbor, their size alone conveying an unspoken threat of unimaginable power. Then the deployment of the Ming Marines, thousands of soldiers in brilliant armor disembarking in perfect, silent formation, their discipline a stark contrast to the often chaotic local militias. This was psychological warfare at its most refined, a demonstration meant to communicate one simple, terrifying message. Resistance is not just futile, it is unthinkable. We are not here as merchants to haggle, we are here as representatives of the Son of Heaven, and you will treat us with the awe we deserve. This overwhelming first impression set the stage for all subsequent negotiations, ensuring Zheng He entered every discussion from a position of unassailable strength. Once the power dynamic was established, the dance of gift-giving began, and this was where the true secret code revealed itself. The presents carried by the fleet were not random acts of generosity, they were carefully calibrated instruments of foreign policy. The types of goods offered, exquisite silks, fine porcelain, gold and silverwares, were deliberately chosen to showcase the immense technical and artistic superiority of Ming China. Presenting a ruler with a vase of cobalt blue porcelain, a technology utterly unknown to them, was a way of saying, "Our civilization can produce wonders you cannot even comprehend." But the strategy went deeper. The gifts were also tailored to the specific desires and vulnerabilities of each ruler. For a leader in a region known for its horse breeding, the fleet might present magnificent bridles and saddles, acknowledging their expertise while subtly suggesting that even their best products required Chinese refinement to reach their ultimate luxury. For a kingdom embroiled in a local conflict, a gift of high-quality steel for weapons could be a veiled offer of support or a warning, depending on how the meeting proceeded. Each gift was a sentence in a silent conversation, a way to reward cooperation, hint at consequences, and bind foreign leaders to China through a web of obligation and desire. Beneath this public spectacle of power and exchange, Zheng He's mission also had a covert, intelligence-gathering objective. His massive crews included scholars, linguists, and scribes whose job was to observe and record everything. They compiled detailed reports on local customs, political structures, economic strengths, military capabilities, and even geographical features. This information was a form of currency more valuable than gold. Knowing which local minister was ambitious, which kingdom was feuding with its neighbor, or which port had the best access to fresh water gave Zheng He a tremendous advantage in negotiations. He could leverage these insights to mediate disputes, playing one faction against another to ensure outcomes favorable to Ming interests, all while appearing as a neutral, benevolent arbitrator. This intelligence network, spread across the Indian Ocean, effectively made the treasure fleet the eyes and ears of the Ming court, creating a vast, early form of global intelligence apparatus that allowed China to manage its foreign relations with a sophistication that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. The grandeur was the show, but the secrets gathered in plain sight were the real source of the fleet's enduring influence. Yet this immense maritime operation, for all its grandeur, left behind a legacy far more subtle than sunken treasure or diplomatic treaties, a hidden ecological footprint that quietly reshaped the landscapes and biospheres of the ports it touched. While we often focus on the cultural and political exchanges, we rarely consider the environmental cost of supporting a floating city of 28,000 people for years at a time. The sheer scale of the treasure fleet's needs meant that every landfall was not just a diplomatic encounter, but a major economic and environmental event. Local ecosystems, some of them fragile and isolated, were suddenly confronted with the resource demands of a small civilization arriving from the sea. This unseen impact is one of the most profound and overlooked secrets of the voyages, a testament to how human ambition, even in the pursuit of peace, can irrevocably alter the natural world. The most immediate demand was for fresh water and food. Imagine the scene when 300 ships, carrying a population larger than London at the time, arrived at a small port town in Sumatra or Sri Lanka. Their first requirement was to refill their massive water casks, draining local wells and streams to quench the thirst of tens of thousands of sailors. Then came the need for provisions. While the fleet carried vast stores of salted meats, rice, and soybeans, they relied on fresh local supplies to replenish their stocks and combat scurvy. This meant purchasing or sometimes requisitioning enormous quantities of fruit, vegetables, and livestock from the surrounding area. For a local economy, this was a windfall, but for the local environment, it could trigger a chain reaction. A sudden, massive harvest of coconuts or citrus fruits could strip trees bare, while the demand for meat could lead to overhunting of local wildlife or the sudden culling of domestic herds, disrupting carefully balanced agricultural practices that had sustained communities for generations. Beyond sustenance, the fleet's constant need for maintenance and repair posed an even greater threat to regional forests. These were wooden ships, and the punishing journey across thousands of miles of salt water and under the fierce tropical sun meant they were in a constant state of decay and damage. Hulls needed recaulking with pitch and tar, masts needed replacing, and planks needed repairing after storms. This required an endless supply of high-quality timber and specialized resins. In places like Palembang in Sumatra or the Malabar coast of India, the arrival of the fleet would have triggered a frenzy of logging activity. Local rulers, eager to curry favor with the Ming admiral, would have ordered their subjects to fell massive trees, teak, mahogany, and other hardwoods prized for their strength and resistance to rot. The scale of this deforestation for just a single shipyard visit would have been significant. For a fleet of hundreds, it could denude entire hillsides. This loss of forest cover had lasting consequences, leading to soil erosion, the silting up of rivers, and the destruction of habitats for countless species, changes that some of those regions are still coping with today. Perhaps the most lasting and unexpected ecological impact, however, came from the silent passengers the fleet carried in its holds, invasive species. The treasure ships were accidental arks, transporting plants, animals, insects, and microbes across oceanic barriers that had existed for millennia. In the damp, dark holds, nestled among the trade goods and food supplies, rats and insects could stow away, disembarking in new lands where they had no natural predators. More significantly, the fleet itself was a vector for plant life. The ballast soil used to stabilize the ships in their holds often contained the seeds of foreign plants. When this soil was dumped in a new port to make room for cargo, it could introduce aggressive new weeds that would choke out native flora. Likewise, the food stores they brought, including grains, fruits, and vegetables, could have included seeds or cuttings that were either deliberately traded or accidentally discarded, taking root in new soil. This biological exchange, an unintended side effect of global connectivity, began to homogenize ecologies, blending the biological distinctiveness of continents long before the Columbian exchange is traditionally said to have begun. The wake of Zheng He's fleet, therefore, was not just a line in the water. It was a permanent green scar across the ecosystems of the Indian Ocean, a hidden cost of exploration that continues to shape the natural world we see today. Navigating the vast and often treacherous expanse of the Indian Ocean required more than just sturdy ships and a good compass. It demanded a profound, almost intuitive understanding of the sky, the sea, and the very breath of the wind itself. While European explorers of the same era often found themselves trapped for months in calms or battered by storms they never saw coming, Zheng He's fleet moved with a rhythmic, predictable cadence that must have seemed like magic to outside observers. This was not magic, however. It was the product of an advanced, systematic mastery of meteorology and oceanography, a secret weapon that transformed the world's most formidable ocean into a predictable highway for the Ming treasure ships. Their ability to harness the monsoon winds represents one of the most brilliant yet understated technological achievements of the entire age of exploration. At the core of this mastery was their deep, generational knowledge of the Indian Ocean's monsoon system. Unlike the Atlantic, which has more variable winds, the Indian Ocean operates on a colossal, seasonal pendulum swing. For roughly 6 months of the year, the winds blow relentlessly from the northeast, and for the other 6, they reverse direction, blowing with equal force from the southwest. Zheng He's navigators didn't just know this basic pattern, they understood its intricate nuances, the precise timing of its shifts, its varying strength along different latitudes, and the localized effects of coastlines and currents. This allowed them to plan their entire voyage like a meticulously timed dance. They would depart from China in the winter or early spring, catching the northeast monsoon to sail swiftly down the coast of Southeast Asia and across the Bay of Bengal. Then they would conduct their trade and diplomacy in India, Arabia, and Africa, waiting for the winds to reverse. Once the southwest monsoon began, they would ride it all the way back home, a tailwind pushing their heavy-laden ships effortlessly toward China. This strategic use of the monsoons meant they were almost always sailing with the wind, not against it, granting them a speed and efficiency that doubled the range of their expeditions and minimized the physical strain on both ships and crew. Their predictive abilities, however, almost certainly extended far beyond this seasonal calendar. To safeguard a fleet of hundreds of vessels, the navigators needed to forecast short-term weather events, the sudden squalls, typhoons, and rogue waves that could spell disaster. While we have no surviving manuals detailing their exact methods, we can infer a highly sophisticated observational science based on known Chinese practices and the sheer success of their voyages. Their weather prediction likely involved a constant multi-sensory analysis of their environment. They would have read the clouds with an expert eye, recognizing the specific formations that heralded a coming storm, such as the thickening cirrus clouds that often precede a typhoon by several days. They watched the behavior of seabirds, knowing that certain species fly lower or head toward land when bad weather approaches. They observed the color and texture of the ocean itself, the direction of swells, and even the appearance of halos around the moon, all of which are reliable indicators of atmospheric changes. This empirical knowledge was almost certainly codified and passed down through poems, songs, and rhymed Chinese letter kujure, or mnemonic chants, making it easy for generations of sailors to memorize complex meteorological relationships. A simple verse might link the appearance of a red sky at dawn with specific sailing instructions for the day ahead. Furthermore, their understanding was likely grounded in a philosophical framework that saw weather not as a random act of God, but as a comprehensible interplay of natural forces, the balance of yin and yang, or the movement of the 5 phases. This holistic view encouraged them to look for patterns and connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena, giving them a predictive edge that mariners relying on superstition or prayer simply did not possess. This deep environmental literacy, this ability to truly listen to the ocean, was what allowed Zheng He's colossal armada to crisscross the world's 3rd largest ocean for 3 decades without a single recorded catastrophe, a safety record that stands as a silent testament to their unparalleled skill. This puzzling absence of physical relics in China stands in stark contrast to the wealth of evidence found scattered across the Indian Ocean, forcing us to ask what happened to the tangible proof of this monumental chapter in history. The most immediate and tragic answer points to the deliberate destruction of artifacts during times of immense political and social upheaval. The fall of the Ming dynasty in 1644 was not a peaceful transition. It was a cataclysmic event marked by rebellion, invasion, and the systematic dismantling of the previous regime's symbols by the conquering king forces. Imperial warehouses in Nanjing and Beijing, which would have held the most treasured mementos from the voyages, detailed ship models, ceremonial gifts from foreign kings, unique navigational instruments, would have been prime targets for looters or for the new government itself, eager to erase the grandeur of the dynasty it had just overthrown. This pattern of intentional destruction likely repeated itself during later periods of turmoil, most notably the catastrophic Taiping Rebellion of the 1850s, where countless historical archives and artifacts were lost in the widespread violence. and even during the more recent cultural revolution of the 20th century, when Red Guards targeted ancient artifacts and texts as symbols of the oppressive Four Olds they sought to eradicate. In this light, the vanishing artifacts become victims of a cyclical pattern in Chinese history, where the new order often sought to legitimize itself by physically demolishing the accomplishments of the old. Yet another compelling theory suggests that many of these precious objects were never meant to be kept in China at all, but were instead designed as instruments of diplomacy, distributed as gifts to foreign rulers with no expectation of their return. The entire economic model of the tributary system was based on this principle of magnificent one-way generosity. The Ming court would bestow upon a foreign leader lavish gifts of silk, gold, and porcelain of a quality and artistry that local craftsmen could not replicate, and in return, that leader would formally acknowledge the emperor's supremacy and send back a token of their own local produce. This created a relationship of immense obligation and awe. From the perspective of the Ming bureaucrats, these objects had served their purpose the moment they left the ship's hold. Their value was diplomatic, not sentimental or historical. They were logged in imperial records as expenses, not as treasures to be curated for a museum. Therefore, the greatest collection of artifacts from Zheng He's voyages isn't missing. It's proudly displayed in museums and private collections from Kenya to Iran, from Sri Lanka to Indonesia, where they have been cherished as heirlooms for centuries, their true origin story often overshadowed by their local history. Perhaps the most tantalizing possibility is that a trove of evidence still exists, hidden away in long-forgotten imperial warehouses or tucked within the archives of ancient temples. China's history is incredibly deep, and many of its old storage systems, particularly those from the Ming era, were vast and labyrinthine. It is not unthinkable that a sealed repository, perhaps buried or walled up during a time of crisis to protect its contents, has simply been lost to time, its location forgotten as generations passed and cities were rebuilt atop the old ones. Furthermore, some artifacts may have entered private hands or been entrusted to Buddhist monasteries for safekeeping, far from the political centers of power. Temples, with their long-term stability and tradition of preserving knowledge, would have been ideal sanctuaries for valuable objects that court officials wanted to save from destruction. These items would not be catalogued in any state museum inventory. They would be part of the temple's own sacred history, perhaps misidentified or their significance forgotten by the current custodians. The potential for a dramatic discovery, a trunk full of star charts in a monastic library, a set of admiral's seals in a hidden altar, or even a preserved treasure ship rudder in a sealed warehouse remains a very real and thrilling prospect for archaeologists, a secret still waiting patiently to be uncovered. Beneath the official narrative of peaceful diplomacy and generous gift-giving, the treasure fleets of Zheng He projected power through a far more pragmatic and often ruthless doctrine, overwhelming and decisive military force. While the historical records, carefully curated by the Ming court, emphasize the awe-inspiring spectacle and peaceful intent, a closer examination reveals that these voyages were also instruments of coercion and intervention, designed to crush any resistance to China's vision of an orderly, tributary world. The Armada was not merely a floating embassy, it was the largest and most advanced naval battle group on the planet, and it was not afraid to use its terrifying capabilities to enforce the will of the Son of Heaven. One of the most pressing and practical justifications for this military might was the persistent threat of piracy. The vital sea lanes of Southeast Asia, particularly the narrow straits of Malacca, have been a haven for pirates for centuries, preying on merchant vessels that carried the wealth of empires. For Zheng He's fleet, laden with unimaginable treasure, these pirates represented not just a nuisance but a direct challenge to imperial authority and a threat to the mission's economic viability. The admiral's response was not negotiation, it was annihilation. The most famous of these anti-piracy campaigns targeted the powerful Chinese pirate Lord Chen Zhui, who had established a formidable base in Palembang, Sumatra. Chen Zhui controlled the straits, extorting and plundering ships with impunity. When Zheng He arrived, he initially offered the pirate chieftain a chance to submit peacefully. Chen Zhui pretended to agree, all the while planning a surprise attack on the fleet. Zheng He, forewarned or simply anticipating the betrayal, was ready. In a fierce naval battle, the pirate fleet, though formidable, was utterly outmatched by the disciplined Ming sailors and the devastating firepower of the treasure ship's cannons and incendiary weapons. Chen Zui's forces were decimated, his ships destroyed, and he himself was captured. In a stark message to any who would challenge Ming supremacy, Zheng He took the pirate lord and his chief lieutenants back to China, where they were publicly executed. This swift and brutal action did not just eliminate a single pirate. It effectively pacified the entire region for years to come, securing the sea lanes for all traders and demonstrating that the emperor's reach extended even to the most lawless corners of the ocean. Beyond dealing with outlaws, the fleet also actively intervened in the internal politics of sovereign states, acting as a regional peacekeeper whose judgments always served Ming interests. A prime example is the situation in Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. The island was divided among several rival kingdoms, and one ruler, Alekshvara, grew increasingly hostile toward the Chinese. According to some accounts, he disrespectfully demanded tribute from Zheng He and even laid an ambush for the Ming forces when they came ashore. Zheng He, recognizing the threat, feigned retreat, luring Alekshvara's army away from its fortified positions. Then, in a brilliant tactical maneuver, he deployed a contingent of his troops to make a daring overland march and seize the capital city, effectively capturing the king's family and court. When the main Sinhalese army returned, they found themselves trapped between the main Ming force and the soldiers holding their capital. The battle was a complete rout. Alekshvara and his entire royal family were taken captive and transported back to the Yongle emperor's court. Rather than executing them, the emperor, in a calculated display of magnanimous authority, pardoned the foolish king and installed a new, more compliant ruler in his place who would be forever grateful to and dependent on Ming support. This was not a simple diplomatic incident. It was a full-scale military invasion and regime change, executed with precision to ensure a pro-Chinese government ruled a strategically vital island on the key trade routes to India and Arabia. These actions, from crushing pirates to deposing kings, were underpinned by a constant and deliberate strategy of psychological intimidation. The very design of the treasure ships was a weapon of awe. Imagine the sheer terror of a coastal village or a rival king's court when these floating fortresses, some longer than a modern naval destroyer, appeared on the horizon. Their 9 masts blotting out the sun, their hulls painted with fearsome eyes to see their way through perilous waters, they were designed to overwhelm and terrify before a single soldier disembarked. The fleet's orderly maneuvers, the flawless drills of its thousands of marines, and the thunderous, demonstrative firing of its cannons during ceremonial arrivals were all part of a carefully choreographed theater of power. The message was unambiguous: resistance is not just futile but irrational. We possess force beyond your comprehension, and we will use it to create the stable, hierarchical world order our emperor desires. This blend of calculated diplomacy and the ever-present threat of overwhelming violence ensured that for 3 decades the Indian Ocean was effectively a Chinese lake, its peace kept not by mutual agreement, but by the silent, looming shadow of the treasure ship's immense sails. While the compass and starboards were the workhorses of daily navigation, the true intellectual peak of the treasure fleet's celestial mastery may have been reserved for moments of high diplomacy, transforming the night sky into a theater of power. Imagine the scene: the massive fleet anchored in a foreign bay, the decks lit by lanterns, and local rulers invited aboard the flagship as honored guests. After a display of material wealth and martial discipline, the admiral might then turn their attention upward, revealing a secret weapon far more impressive than any cannon, a seemingly magical command of the heavens themselves. This was not merely about finding north, it was about demonstrating that the Ming court possessed a profound, almost divine understanding of the cosmic order, a knowledge that positioned the Son of Heaven as the literal link between the celestial and the terrestrial realms. To achieve this, the fleet's astronomers likely employed instruments of breathtaking sophistication. While the simple Kaiyangxingban starboard was for the common sailor, the ship's masters and scholarly envoys would have had access to far more advanced tools, perhaps even portable versions of the complex devices used in the Imperial Observatory. One such instrument could have been a mariner's astrolabe or a simplified armillary sphere, a ringed model of the cosmos used to measure the altitude of stars and planets with incredible precision. In the hands of a trained scholar, this device could predict eclipses, track the movements of planets like Jupiter and Venus, and map the passage of constellations not just for navigation but for prophecy and ceremony. By accurately forecasting a lunar eclipse or the appearance of a comet during a state visit, Zheng He could stage a breathtaking spectacle, presenting the event not as a natural phenomenon but as a deliberate affirmation of the Ming Emperor's heavenly mandate, a sign of his harmony with the universe that he could seemingly command for the benefit of his allies. This celestial theater likely extended to the very scheduling and routing of the voyages. The fleet's departures and arrivals at key ports may have been carefully timed to coincide with significant astronomical events, such as solstices, equinoxes, or the zenith passage of certain important stars. Arriving at the court of a powerful sultan on the day of a solstice, a date the Chinese could calculate with exactness while others might only estimate, would have been a potent demonstration of superior scientific knowledge. Furthermore, the sheer discipline of the fleet's movements could itself be a form of celestial mimicry. The coordinated maneuvers of hundreds of ships, shifting formation with flawless precision in response to flag signals, may have been designed to mirror the orderly, predictable movements of the stars and planets, creating a visible, earthly reflection of the cosmic harmony the Emperor claimed to embody. For observers on shore, this display of synchronized movement on such an immense scale would have been as awe-inspiring and incomprehensible as the patterns of the night sky, reinforcing the message that China's power was as natural, inevitable, and vast as the cosmos itself. In this way, astronomy was fused with statecraft, turning the predictable cycles of the universe into the most powerful diplomatic language imaginable. Beneath the grand spectacle of diplomacy and the awe-inspiring display of naval power, the treasure fleets of Zheng He operated one of the most sophisticated and far-reaching economic engines the world had ever seen. While the official records emphasized the lofty goals of spreading the emperor's virtue and receiving tribute from awestruck kingdoms, a parallel and often hidden commercial network was humming with activity, meticulously designed to enrich the Ming dynasty's coffers and secure a steady flow of exotic goods. This was not a simple exchange of gifts, it was a calculated system of state-sponsored capitalism on a global scale, creating economic dependencies and exclusive trade agreements that funneled wealth back to China long after the last ship had sailed. The foundation of this system was the tributary framework itself, which cleverly disguised a highly favorable trade model beneath a veneer of ceremonial protocol. When a foreign ruler offered their tribute local products like spices, rare woods, or exotic animals, the Ming court was obligated by custom to reciprocate with gifts from the emperor. However, these return gifts, typically silks, porcelain, and silver, were always of far greater market value than the tribute received. On the surface, this looked like imperial generosity, a magnificent lost leader. But in reality, it was a brilliant investment. By overwhelming these rulers with luxurious Chinese goods, the Ming court created an insatiable appetite for them among the local elites. The foreign ruler, now possessing these prestigious items, became the primary distributor of Chinese luxury goods in their region, effectively turning them into a Ming commercial agent. They were hooked, and to acquire more, they were compelled to return the following year with even greater amounts of tribute, locking them into a cycle of economic dependency that consistently benefited China. Beyond these formal ceremonies, the fleet engaged in direct, vigorous private trade that operated in the shadows of the official mission. Each of the hundreds of ships had holds not only for imperial treasure, but also for the personal trading goods of the crew members, from the admirals down to the common sailors. This was a well-established perk, a way to motivate and pay the massive crews without draining the state treasury. When the fleet anchored, a bustling, temporary market would spring up on the decks and shores, where Chinese merchants and sailors traded directly with local vendors. They bartered everyday items like pottery, tools, and cloth for personally lucrative goods, fragrant spices from the Moluccas, pearls from the Persian Gulf, rare medicinal herbs from India. This decentralized, grassroots trading activity was a secret economy within the economy, generating immense personal wealth for those involved and creating a web of commercial relationships that operated independently of, yet were protected by, the intimidating presence of the imperial armada. The most lasting economic impact, however, was the establishment of secure, Ming-guaranteed trade routes that shattered existing monopolies. Before Zheng He, the flow of goods between Asia and the Middle East was controlled by a complex and often predatory chain of middlemen. Arab, Indian, and Malay merchants who each took a cut, dramatically inflating prices by the time goods reached their final destination. The treasure fleets, by sailing directly from China to the source of these goods, completely disrupted this ancient system. They could pick up pepper and gems directly in Calicut, load frankincense and myrrh in Aden, and collect ivory in Somalia, all without paying a single intermediary markup. This not only drastically reduced costs for the Ming court, but also destabilized the economies of traditional trading hubs that had thrived on their role as gatekeepers. The fleet's ability to project overwhelming force ensured these new, direct routes remained safe from the piracy that had previously made them prohibitively risky, effectively creating the world's first supervised global trade highway. The wealth this generated wasn't just in the goods themselves, it was in the total control of the supply chain, a secret of economic power that the Ming dynasty wielded with unparalleled effectiveness for decades. But managing this floating empire of 28,000 souls from dozens of different ethnic backgrounds and regions of China required a solution to perhaps the most fundamental challenge of all. How do you talk to each other, let alone the world? This brings us to a secret that operated in the background of every negotiation, every trade, and every command. The ingenious linguistic and communication systems that turned the treasure fleet into a floating Tower of Babel that actually worked. While we marvel at the ships and the diplomacy, we often overlook the sheer miracle of communication that made it all possible. Coordinating a fleet of that size required a flawless internal command structure, while engaging with hundreds of cultures from Vietnam to Zanzibar demanded a diplomatic and linguistic flexibility that was centuries ahead of its time. The solution was a multi-layered system of language and protocol that did much more than just translate words. It built bridges of understanding across entire civilizations. At the heart of the fleet's internal operations was undoubtedly a standardized form of Mandarin, the official language of the Ming court, used for all formal orders, log entries, and communications between the flagship and the other vessels. But this was only the top layer. The crew itself was a mosaic of China's southern coastal regions, particularly Fujian and Guangdong provinces, meaning dialects like Hokkien, Cantonese, and Teochew would have filled the lower decks. To maintain discipline and clarity amidst this linguistic diversity, the fleet's officers likely enforced a strict protocol for commands, using a standardized set of nautical terms and signals that transcended dialectical differences. This created a functional, operational language unique to the treasure fleet itself, a jargon of the sea that every sailor, regardless of his origin, was required to understand for the sake of safety and efficiency. This internal linguistic order was the glue that held the massive armada together, turning a collection of individuals into a single, coordinated organism. When the fleet dropped anchor in a new port, however, a completely different linguistic strategy took over. They could not rely on force to communicate. They needed to build trust, and that started with speaking the local language. This is where Zheng He's foresight in recruiting his crews becomes evident. The fleet did not sail with just sailors and soldiers. It included a dedicated corps of translators known as huishi, or interpretation officials. These were not mere amateur linguists. Many were Muslims from the western regions of China who already had familiarity with Persian and Arabic, the lingua franca of the Indian Ocean trade routes. Others were recruited from merchant communities in southern China that had traded for generations with Southeast Asia, bringing knowledge of Malay, Tamil, and Siamese. These specialists were the admiral's secret weapons, allowing him to negotiate directly with local rulers without relying on potentially unreliable third-party interpreters, ensuring that the subtle nuances of diplomacy and the precise terms of trade agreements were communicated exactly as intended. The true, lasting secret of this linguistic effort, however, may be found in the bustling, improvised markets that sprang up whenever the fleet made landfall. While the huishi handled high-level diplomacy, the common sailors and traders needed a way to barter for supplies and souvenirs. In these vibrant, chaotic exchanges, something remarkable was born: the early seeds of pidgin languages. A pidgin is a simplified hybrid language that develops between groups who do not share a common tongue, combining elements of each to facilitate basic trade. The constant, sustained contact between Chinese sailors and merchants in ports from Malacca to Hormuz would have been the perfect incubator for such languages. We can imagine a rudimentary trade jargon emerging, blending basic Chinese nouns with Malay verbs and Arabic or Persian terms for numbers and goods, all structured with a simple, universal grammar. This maritime pidgin would have allowed a sailor from Nanjing to successfully bargain for fruit with a vendor in Mogadishu. While no direct records of this specific pidgin survive, linguists see its potential influence in later trade languages that flourished in these regions. The communication systems pioneered out of necessity by Zheng He's polyglot armada may have laid the foundational groundwork for the networks of understanding that would continue to connect the Indian Ocean world for centuries after the treasure ships themselves had vanished from the waves. The construction of Zheng He's treasure ships represents one of history's most profound maritime engineering puzzles, a secret locked within the very grain of their colossal wooden frames. How did Ming Dynasty shipwrights, working without powered tools or computer models, manage to build vessels that dwarfed anything else on the water for centuries to come? The answer lies not in a single miraculous technique, but in a sophisticated, integrated system of naval architecture that combined brilliant innovation with centuries of accumulated wisdom, much of which was tragically lost when the voyages ended. To understand these ships is to peel back layers of a technological mystery that began long before the first tree was felled. The process started in the imperial shipyards of Nanjing, a vast industrial complex on the Yangtze River that was the 15th century equivalent of a modern naval dry dock. Here, the selection of timber was not a matter of simple logistics but a ritual of immense importance. Shipwrights sought out ancient, massive hardwoods, particularly teak and mahogany, from the jungles of Yunnan and Southeast Asia, prized for their natural resistance to rot and shipworms. These weren't just planks, they were the bones of a leviathan. The wood was carefully seasoned, sometimes for years, to prevent warping, but the true secret may have been in more advanced treatment methods. Some historians speculate that the Chinese used sophisticated oil-based preservatives or even early chemical treatments derived from tung oil or lacquer trees to further fortify the wood against the relentless assault of saltwater and marine borers, a protective technology that would have been invaluable on long ocean voyages. Once prepared, the timber was shaped using a revolutionary framing technique that defied conventional European shipbuilding. While Western ships of the era were built with a rigid internal skeleton of ribs to which planks were attached, the treasure ships appear to have been constructed using a method known as carvel build with bulkheads. This meant the hull was built first, with incredibly thick, multiple-layered planks edge-joined and fastened with iron nails and wooden dowels. Only after this strong, flexible shell was complete were the internal supports, the famous watertight bulkheads, added. These bulkheads were the fleet's most celebrated innovation, a series of solid transverse walls that divided the hull into separate compartments. If the ship was breached, only one section would flood, allowing the vessel to remain afloat and salvageable. This was a concept so advanced that it wouldn't become standard in the West until the 19th century, and it remains a cornerstone of naval architecture to this day. The precision of the joinery in these walls was astounding. They were fitted so tightly that they were effectively watertight without the need for caulking, a testament to the impeccable skill of the Ming craftsmen. The rigging and sail systems were another masterpiece of engineering, designed to harness the wind with maximum efficiency. Each of the 9 masts on a treasure ship was a carefully engineered structure, likely made from a single, enormous tree trunk, stepped deeply into the keel to distribute the immense strain. The sails themselves were not the simple square sails of European carracks, but what are known as balanced lug sails, a sophisticated design that was far more efficient at sailing into the wind. These were vast sheets of strong bamboo matting and cloth, reinforced with horizontal battens that allowed the sail to be raised, lowered, and reefed with remarkable control even in high winds. This rigging system gave the massive ships a surprising degree of maneuverability, allowing them to tack against the wind in a way that would have been impossible for their heavier, clumsier European counterparts. The secret to handling these behemoths likely lay in a system of massive capstans and complex pulley systems operated by teams of sailors, a coordinated effort to manage the enormous forces acting on the sails and rudder. Perhaps the most enduring mystery, however, is the one surrounding the ship's legendary rudder. The discovery of a massive rudder post in the 1950s at the Nanjing shipyard site provides the most compelling physical evidence for the ship's immense size. This single piece of wood was so large it could only have controlled a rudder over 30 feet tall. Mounting and controlling such a giant steering oar on a wooden ship presents an almost unbelievable engineering challenge. It would have required a massive multi-point pivot system and a complex arrangement of ropes and winches, likely operated by multiple crew members simultaneously. The hydrodynamic forces on such a rudder in rough seas would have been tremendous, threatening to tear it from its mountings. How the Ming shipwrights solved this problem of stress and control remains one of the great lost secrets of naval engineering, a solution that allowed them to steer a 400-foot wooden ship across the open ocean with a precision that still eludes full understanding. The tragic epilogue to this story of innovation is that these advanced techniques were not just forgotten, they were actively suppressed and lost. When the Confucian officials gained power and halted the voyages, they saw the vast shipyards not as a national treasure, but as a symbol of wasteful extravagance. The skilled artisans, the detailed plans, the specialized tools all were dispersed or destroyed to prevent any future emperor from restarting the program. The knowledge passed down through generations of master shipwrights died with them, leaving behind only the stone pillar and a few tantalizing artifacts as clues. The treasure ships were not merely products of their time, they were the peak of a technological tradition that was abruptly severed, a reminder that progress is not inevitable and that the greatest secrets are sometimes those we deliberately choose to forget. But beyond the sheer physical presence of the ships and soldiers, Zheng He and his advisors mastered a more subtle and terrifying form of psychological manipulation, the weaponization of sound and spectacle. Imagine the fleet's arrival not in silence, but as a deafening, multi-sensory event designed to overwhelm rational thought and trigger primal awe. As the armada approached a foreign coast, the air would have been filled with a calculated cacophony. The deep, resonant pounding of massive drums, their rhythm precise and militaristic, would have carried for miles, a sound that vibrated not just in the ears but in the chests of those on shore. This would be interwoven with the clashing of cymbals and the haunting, melodic tones of pipes and flutes, creating a disorienting soundscape that was both beautiful and utterly alien. The pinnacle of this auditory assault, however, was likely the deployment of gunpowder. While European armies used early cannons for their destructive force, the Chinese had perfected pyrotechnics into an art form. As the fleet drew near, the decks of the treasure ships would have erupted not in cannon fire aimed at the city, but in a breathtaking, terrifying display of fireworks. Rockets would screech into the sky, exploding in showers of colorful fire and thunderous booms that echoed across the water. For a culture that had never witnessed gunpowder, the effect would have been indistinguishable from magic or divine wrath. The message was clear: we command the very elements of fire and sound. Our technology is so advanced it borders on the supernatural. This was not just a show. It was a deliberate demonstration of a power so immense it could choose to entertain rather than destroy, a nuance that made the underlying threat of violence even more potent. The local ruler, watching from the shore, was left with an unavoidable conclusion. These visitors could just as easily rain down hellfire as they could celestial flowers, and the choice was entirely theirs. This theatricality extended to the carefully choreographed disembarkation of the Ming Marines and the presentation of gifts. The soldiers did not simply march off the ships. They performed intricate drills on the beaches, moving in flawless, synchronized formations that showcased a level of discipline and coordination unheard of in most local armies. This was a display of collective will, proving that every man in this vast force was an extension of a single, unstoppable intelligence. Finally, the gifts themselves were presented with elaborate ceremony. Bolts of silk were unfurled to catch the sun, porcelain was displayed on lacquered trays, and gold was offered in ornate chests. Each item was handled with a ritualistic reverence that elevated it from a simple commodity to a symbol of an unimaginably refined and wealthy culture. The entire performance, from the thunderous arrival to the silent, graceful offering of treasures, was a meticulously scripted narrative of power. It communicated that China was not merely strong, it was civilized, advanced, and benevolent to those who submitted, but undoubtedly merciless to those who resisted. Zheng He understood that the most effective conquest is not always of land, but of the mind, and his fleet was engineered to achieve victory long before any negotiation even began. Yet woven into the very fabric of the treasure fleets, beyond the silks and the silver, was a cargo of an entirely different nature, one that held a significance far beyond any material value. The holds of these ships carried not just goods for trade, but objects of profound spiritual power, a hidden arsenal of faith that Zheng He deployed with the same strategic precision as his cannons and marines. This was a multi-faith approach to diplomacy, a brilliant and often overlooked secret that allowed the admiral to build bridges of the soul with the incredibly diverse religious landscapes he encountered, from the Buddhist kingdoms of Southeast Asia to the Hindu temples of India and the Islamic sultanates of Arabia and Africa. The fleet itself was a floating testament to this spiritual pluralism. While Zheng He was a devout Muslim, the voyages were commissioned by the Yongle Emperor, who heavily patronized Buddhism and presented himself as a universal Buddhist monarch, a Chakravartin ruler. To navigate this complex dynamic, the Armada became a microcosm of Ming's spiritual life. On board the massive treasure ships, Buddhist monks traveled alongside Islamic imams and likely Taoist astrologers as well, each group serving a vital purpose. The monks were scholars and diplomats tasked with seeking out sacred Buddhist texts and relics in India and Sri Lanka, the homeland of their faith. Their presence signaled a deep respect for the religious traditions of the regions they visited, allowing Zheng He to engage with powerful monastic communities on their own terms. Imagine the scene when the fleet arrived in Ceylon. The Chinese monks would have been able to disembark and engage in deep theological discussions with their Sinhalese counterparts, sharing rituals and paying respect at holy sites like the Temple of the Tooth in Kandy. This wasn't just a courtesy visit, it was a powerful diplomatic gambit, demonstrating that the Ming Empire was not an alien force but a fellow traveler on the path to enlightenment, a civilized power that valued wisdom and spiritual merit. For his interactions with the Islamic world, Zheng He's personal faith became his most potent diplomatic tool. When the fleet arrived in the port of Malacca or the holy city of Calicut, he could step ashore not merely as a foreign admiral, but as a brother in faith. He could observe prayers in local mosques, converse with learned scholars in Arabic or Persian, and participate in religious festivals. This shared identity immediately lowered barriers and built a foundation of trust that pure military might could never achieve. The ships carried precious Islamic texts, finely copied Qurans, and beautifully crafted prayer rugs, which were presented as gifts to local mosques and sultans. These were not generic treasures, they were deeply symbolic offerings that showed a respectful understanding of the recipient's core beliefs. In doing so, Zheng He effectively became the Ming dynasty's ambassador to the entire Muslim world, fostering trade and political alliances that were cemented in shared worship. His reported dispatch of deputies to perform the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca was the ultimate expression of this, a gesture that resonated across the Islamic world, proving that the Son of Heaven's influence and respect extended even to its holiest sites. But the spiritual strategy extended even to the realm of the mystical and the celestial, where Taoist symbolism and practice played a crucial role. The fleet's incredible navigational success relied on a mastery of astronomy that was deeply intertwined with Taoist cosmology. The astrologers on board interpreted celestial events, comets, eclipses, the movements of planets not just as navigational aids, but as omens bearing messages from heaven about the legitimacy and fortune of the voyage and the emperor it represented. When the fleet presented a foreign ruler with a giraffe identified as a mythical Qilin, they were employing a potent piece of Taoist-inspired propaganda. The Qilin was a celestial omen, a sign of a sage ruler's virtue. By presenting this African animal as the manifestation of this myth, Zheng He was delivering a powerful message. The natural and supernatural worlds themselves affirmed the Yongle Emperor's divine right to rule all under heaven. This multi-layered spiritual diplomacy, blending Buddhist scholarship, Islamic kinship, and Taoist symbolism, allowed Zheng He to speak a dozen different religious languages fluently. He could present the face of a pious Muslim in one port, a respectful Buddhist devotee in another, and a representative of a cosmically ordained emperor in a third. This chameleon-like ability to connect on a spiritual level was perhaps the most sophisticated and effective weapon in the treasure fleet's vast arsenal, proving that true power often resides not in the ability to conquer, but in the capacity to understand and resonate with the human heart. Life aboard one of Zheng He's massive treasure ships was a world unto itself, a floating micro-society governed by a strict hierarchy, rigorous routine, and an unspoken code of conduct that had to sustain tens of thousands of men for years at a time, completely isolated from the world they knew. This wasn't a brief naval excursion, it was a multi-year deployment into the absolute unknown, and maintaining order, morale, and sanity was a logistical and psychological challenge as immense as the ships themselves. At the top of this complex social structure was the admiral himself, Zheng He, a figure of almost mythical authority who commanded from his grand quarters on the flagship. Below him was a meticulously organized chain of command that included captains for each vessel, military officers, navigators, astrologers, interpreters, and doctors, ensuring that every aspect of the voyage, from sailing to security to diplomacy, had a dedicated leader responsible for its success. For the vast majority of the crew, the sailors, soldiers, craftsmen, and cooks' daily life was a relentless cycle of duty, discipline, and finding small comforts where they could. Their waking hours were dictated by the sounding of bells and drums, which marked the changing of watches and the rhythm of the day. Sailors worked in shifts, constantly tending to the enormous battened lug sails, checking the rigging for wear, and manning the massive steering oars. Soldiers drilled daily on deck, maintaining their combat readiness through practiced formations and weapons training, a spectacle of discipline that also served to intimidate any observer from shore. Craftsmen were in perpetual demand, repairing everything from frayed ropes to splintered deck planks, while cooks labored in dedicated galleys to prepare meals for thousands, relying on massive stores of rice, salted meats, and pickled vegetables, supplemented by fresh fish caught over the rails and fruit acquired in port. In the cramped quarters below deck, where hammocks were slung between the watertight bulkheads, the men had to carve out a sense of community and normalcy. Gambling with dice or simple games was a common, though likely forbidden, pastime to pass the long hours. Storytelling would have been a cherished art, with veterans regaling younger crew members with tales of previous voyages, strange lands they had seen, and the mythical creatures that were said to dwell in the deep. To combat the deep ache of homesickness, many men practiced small personal rituals. They might tend to a tiny personal shrine, making offerings to Tianfei, the celestial consort and goddess of sailors, praying for protection from the terrifying storms that could erupt without warning. Others might trade small carvings or trinkets they had made, a nascent economy of personal mementos that helped forge bonds between men from different regions and backgrounds. This melting pot of cultures, with crew members hailing from different provinces of China, as well as including Muslim interpreters and perhaps even Southeast Asian pilots, inevitably led to tensions. Close quarters, cultural misunderstandings, and the sheer stress of the voyage could easily boil over into conflict. The ship's officers and a dedicated corps of military police would have been responsible for maintaining order, meting out justice quickly and publicly to serve as a deterrent. Punishments for infractions, from theft to insubordination to fighting, were likely severe, drawing from the Ming legal code, which could prescribe flogging, confinement in stocks, or even execution for the most serious offenses. This harsh discipline was the necessary glue that held the floating city together, a clear signal that the mission's success outweighed any individual's discomfort or discontent. Yet the leadership also understood that pure intimidation was not enough to sustain morale. The promise of personal profit was a powerful motivator. As we've discussed, sailors were permitted to engage in small-scale private trade, and the potential to return home with exotic goods that could make a man wealthy was a burning incentive for many. Furthermore, the very awe of their journey served as a form of psychological sustenance. For a young sailor from a rural village, the experience of seeing a towering giraffe for the first time, or marveling at the strange architecture of an African port city, must have been utterly transformative. They were participating in the greatest maritime endeavor in history, a fact that surely instilled a powerful sense of pride and purpose that helped them endure the hardship, danger, and interminable loneliness of life on the endless open ocean. And so we arrive at the final and perhaps most enduring secret of them all, the ultimate destination mystery. Where did the wake of Zheng He's treasure ships truly end? For all the meticulous records of their travels to India, Arabia, and Africa, the most tantalizing question remains unanswered. Did they venture even further into realms that would rewrite the very map of human exploration? We've navigated the politics, the technology, and the personalities, but now we must set our sights on the horizon of the unknown, to the edges of the maps where dragons were said to dwell, and where the evidence for Zheng He's travels becomes a fascinating tapestry of clues, controversy, and sheer possibility. The most credible leap beyond the known routes points south to the vast and enigmatic continent of Australia. The theory that the Chinese discovered Australia long before Captain Cook is not mere fantasy. It is supported by a compelling, if circumstantial, collection of evidence. In the late 1950s, a collection of ancient Chinese artifacts was discovered scattered on a beach in Darwin, in Australia's Northern Territory. These weren't just a few coins, they included a small statue of the god Shu Lao, Ming-era pottery sherds, and a wooden fishing float of a design used for centuries in southern China. While skeptics argue these could have been washed ashore from a later shipwreck or left by 19th century Chinese immigrants, the location and the nature of the finds are deeply suggestive. Furthermore, there are intriguing correlations between certain features on 15th century Chinese maps and the coastline of northern Australia. A landmass labeled as Chinese letter, or Land of the Giants, on some charts bears a curious resemblance to the Gulf of Carpentaria. More convincingly, Aboriginal cave paintings in the Kimberley region appear to depict ships unlike any traditional Indonesian vessels, with high stern castles and multiple masts that look strikingly similar to the Great Treasure ships. These artistic records, passed down through oral tradition, tell of strange men who arrived from the north in large sailing craft. While not definitive proof, this mosaic of archaeological and anthropological clues paints a picture that is difficult to dismiss entirely, suggesting that at least some of Zheng He's scout ships may have reached the shores of the Great Southern Land, making contact with the world's oldest living culture centuries before European colonization. Yet the most explosive and hotly contested theory propels the fleet across the entire Pacific Ocean to the Americas. This idea, popularized by author Gavin Menzies, suggests that Zheng He's fleets not only reached the New World but mapped it comprehensively, circumnavigating the globe decades before Magellan. The evidence presented is a whirlwind of disparate clues. There are the mysterious Chinese anchors found off the coast of California, which we discussed earlier. There is the alleged presence of Asian chickens in pre-Columbian South America, and the sudden, unexplained appearance of precise world maps in Europe, like the Fra Mauro map of 1459, which depicts a detailed outline of Africa that European sailors of the time could not possibly have known, with an inscription crediting a junk from India as its source. The most dramatic claim centers on a massive carved stone tablet, the so-called Bat Creek stone, found in a Native American burial mound in Tennessee in the late 19th century. The inscription on the stone was initially dismissed as Cherokee, but in the 1970s, a epigrapher claimed the characters were a form of Paleo-Hebrew. However, some sinologists have since argued that the characters more closely resemble a stylized form of Chinese seal script, potentially reading something like a proclamation for the settlement of this land. If authentic, which is a monumental if, it would be earth-shattering. The academic pushback against these trans-Pacific theories is unsurprisingly intense and well-argued. Mainstream historians point to the utter lack of uncontested archaeological evidence. No Ming shipwrecks, no Chinese settlements, no definitive inscriptions on the scale of the Norse settlement at Elance Ox Meadows. They argue that the artifacts presented can be explained by later historical events, from Manila galleon trade to 19th century Chinese immigration, and that the map interpretations rely on selective and often anachronistic readings. The debate is a classic clash between heterodox history and academic orthodoxy, a battle over the standards of evidence and the willingness to reconsider a narrative of exploration that has been dominated by European names for 500 years. Perhaps the most elegant and plausible of the further voyage theories is one that requires no Pacific crossing at all, but simply a continuation of the fleet's known African route. What if, after rounding the Horn of Africa, some of Zheng He's ships simply kept going south and west? What if they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Atlantic Ocean decades before the Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias did so in 1488? The monsoon winds that carried the fleet down the East African coast would have naturally pushed them south. With their advanced navigational skills, it is entirely within the realm of possibility that they realized the African continent did in fact have a southern terminus. There is a fascinating, albeit cryptic, mention in the history of the Mali Empire of a strange fleet that arrived on their coast from the ocean, sent by a great king from the east. Could this have been a detachment from Zheng He's fleet, making contact with one of the wealthiest empires in the world, famous for its gold? The potential implications of such a meeting are staggering. It would mean that the Chinese had not only linked the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic, but had also connected the two great gold-producing regions of the medieval world, West Africa and Great Zimbabwe. This would have been an economic and geopolitical coup of unimaginable proportions, creating a maritime Silk Road that stretched across half the globe. The fact that this potential connection was not followed up on, or was perhaps deliberately suppressed by the Ming court upon the fleet's return, only deepens the mystery. It presents a haunting what-if scenario. Had China pursued this route, the subsequent age of exploration led by Portugal and Spain might have looked entirely different, encountering not isolated continents, but a world already connected by a vast Chinese-dominated maritime network. In the end, the ultimate secret of Zheng He's destination may not be a single place on a map, but a profound shift in perspective. The true mystery is why we feel such a powerful need for him to have reached these specific, familiar landmarks: Australia, the Americas, the Cape, to validate his achievement. His documented voyages, the ones we know for certain happened, were already feats of such staggering scale and sophistication that they dwarfed the accomplishments of his European contemporaries. He successfully commanded a fleet of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men on 7 round-trip journeys across the world's largest ocean, establishing peaceful trade and diplomatic relations with dozens of kingdoms. He did this not through conquest and colonization, but through a display of power so immense that it compelled respect through awe. The relentless quest to prove he got there first to somewhere else is, in a way, a capitulation to the very Eurocentric narrative of discovery that his story challenges. His legacy isn't diminished if he never set foot in North America. It is magnified by what he undeniably did achieve. The treasure fleets demonstrated a model of global engagement based on soft power and mutual exchange, a road not taken in world history. Their abrupt end and the deliberate erasure of their records represent one of history's great turning points, a moment when the world could have become interconnected under a very different set of rules. So the final destination we should be most curious about is not a geographical one, but a historical road not taken, a world where the wake of the treasure ships never faded, and where the rhythm of the monsoon winds continued to bind continents together in a network of trade and mutual understanding rather than conquest and extraction. That is the most profound destination of all, and it remains the greatest lost secret of Zheng He's voyages. So as we reach the end of this journey in the wake of the treasure fleets, it becomes clear that the true story of Zheng He is not found in any single document or artifact, but in the incredible constellation of secrets we've explored together. From the mind-bending scale of the 400-foot treasure ships that defied ancient maritime engineering, to the revolutionary navigational tech that harnessed the stars and the monsoons with pinpoint accuracy, we've seen how the political sabotage of a single minister may have erased the official records, creating a historical void that fuels endless speculation about transoceanic voyages to the Americas and Australia. We've uncovered the silent ecological impact of these floating cities, the sophisticated economic machine disguised as tribute, and the terrifying military might that backed their peaceful diplomacy. We've met the man himself, Zheng He, the Muslim eunuch admiral who wielded his unique identity as a diplomatic superpower, bridging cultures from Mecca to Ceylon with a blend of spiritual respect and overwhelming spectacle. And we've felt the haunting absence of the ships themselves, vanished from the seabed, their precious artifacts scattered across the globe or locked away in forgotten repositories, leaving us with only whispers in the form of genetic legacies, ancient maps, and enigmatic anchors on distant shores. Each of these 30 secrets peels back another layer, transforming the voyages from a simple tale of exploration into a multifaceted saga of technological genius, political intrigue, cultural exchange, and profound historical irony. They force us to completely reconsider the narrative of the age of exploration, moving beyond the familiar stories of Columbus and Da Gama to recognize a period of Chinese maritime dominance that was more advanced, more peaceful, and on a scale so vast it seems almost otherworldly. This was not a story of conquest and colonization, but one of attempted integration through awe-inspiring soft power, a demonstration that the world could be connected through trade and diplomacy rather than subjugation. The secrets reveal a historical crossroads, a moment when the entire trajectory of global POWER Chinese letter could have shifted eastward for centuries to come. This leads us to the most provocative question of all: what if? What if the Yongle Emperor had lived longer, or his successors had shared his vision? What if the scholar officials had lost their ideological battle against the eunuchs and the admirals? If China had continued its naval expansion, solidifying its network of bases and trade routes across the Indian Ocean and perhaps beyond, the entire course of world history would be unrecognizable. The power vacuum that European explorers sailed into would never have existed. The age of colonialism, with its devastating impact on indigenous cultures across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, might have unfolded under a completely different and perhaps less destructive set of rules. The world's economic center of gravity might have remained in Asia, and the technological innovations of the treasure ships, their hull designs, their medical systems, their cartographic knowledge could have continued to evolve, potentially accelerating global connectivity by centuries. We are left to ponder a world that was almost within grasp, a path not taken that echoes through history as one of its greatest missed opportunities. The legacy of Zheng He is ultimately a testament to human ambition and its fragility, a reminder that even the grandest achievements can be deliberately forgotten, and that history is written not just by those who explore, but by those who choose to remember. These 30 secrets are more than just fascinating trivia. They are the keys to unlocking a broader, more inclusive understanding of our global past. Now, we want to hear from you. As you reflect on everything from the colossal ships and the lost maps to the medical breakthroughs and the whispered legends of lost colonies, which one of these incredible secrets amazed you the most? Was it the sheer scale of the fleets, the controversy of the global maps, or the personal story of the admiral himself? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue to unravel the mysteries of history together.